Lord of Industrialization. Welcome back, brave explorers of impossible worlds. We are excited to have you here to continue this odyssey together. Before we continue, everything you'll hear is pure fiction. So please don't try to replicate combat techniques at home. This wonderful story in all its rights belong to its brilliant original author. We are only the messengers of entertainment. Want another dose of adventure? Subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss a single chapter. And if you can't wait, our Patreon has exclusive surprises you'll love. Chapter 126. You come and I. Frederick wasn't commanding the troops this time for fun, but to test his command skills. In this era, the leader of a faction must be capable of battlefield service, otherwise, he would be looked down upon. He took a moment to reminisce about the walkie-talkie he'd used at the construction site in his previous life, and pondered the unit's designation. After the messenger's report, he ordered the headquarters and the chasseur company to the lakeside, where they could better observe the battlefield. Bugles and whistles soon blared from the front, and the various units began to move. First to move were Jurgen's cavalry. They halted in a single, arrogant line about 150 meters from the enemy, firing the P carbines at the enemy. P carbines have short barrels and a slightly shorter range, and their dummy rounds are inaccurate at long range, but projectiles are effective against densely packed enemy groups. The enemy quickly dispersed, and Richardnell, naturally, would not sit still and wait for his turn. After determining the bullet's impact zone, his magic shield immediately erupted, and the white smoke from the dummy rounds formed a cloud above the troops. Meanwhile, the ice cans were adjusting their formation. The right wing prepared a charge to take away the annoying flies, while the left wing prepared a charge against the group moving toward the lake. Jurgen immediately led his cavalry in a slow retreat, raising his rifles higher. Bullets pierced the area where the magic shields were, knocking down several more men. Just then, the ice cans on the opposing right wing began charging them. A few breaths later, Heinz directed his entire regiment to overtake the enemy right flank. The heavy barrage of bullets was stopped by the magic shields, but it also prevented the archers on that side from firing at Jurgen's troops and limited the magician's ability to fire. Jurgen ordered all cavalry to equip explosive spears and form 3 lines to launch a countercharge against the enemy ice cans. As the two groups closed in at high speed, the explosive spears pierced the ice cans, exploding instantly and blasting them back into the elemental ice. The two cavalry units passed each other, and half of the 500 ice cans were instantly destroyed. More than a dozen of Jurgen's men were also pierced by the snow lances, raising their flags and leaving the battlefield. Jurgen and his men quickly formed their ranks, turning their horses before the ice cans could even begin. With revolvers in one hand and sabers in the other, they launched a second charge, aiming at the ice cans' backs. Elsewhere, 500 ice cans charged the center of the column on the ice, attempting to split it in two. Bernd unified the Cherry Company's command, firing a range-bound fire attack along the heavy cavalry's route. The first volley of fire covered a quarter of the heavy cavalry. Heinz, realizing the ice can's route was within his own fire range, sent his battalion on the right flank to provide support. The two sides engaged in a crossfire, quickly eliminating the heavy cavalry. From behind the snowmen, Psyche said to Richardnell, "Your mobile force is gone. You're doomed." Richardnell simply smiled and replied, "Don't worry, they'll take the bait too." With the enemy cavalry defeated, Heinz began to command the entire regiment's attack. 6 of the 8 P companies spread out in a horizontal formation, with 3 platoons in each company staggered forward and backward. The 2 front platoons remained in place, while the rearmost platoon advanced and then paused to defend. Under the cover of the Cherry Company, the 2 P companies in the rear slowly followed, disrupting the enemy without flanking fire. The magic shield stopped numerous simulated bullets and grenades, but this was a drill, and Psyche had also simulated the shield failing due to overload. Heinz quickly determined the shield's resistance and began adjusting his firing rhythm, unleashing as much fire as possible during the gaps when the shield re-erupted. As they drew closer to the enemy, he slowed his advance. Heinz reflected that the maximum range of ordinary bows and arrows was around 150 meters, which was no longer very lethal. He generally released his arrows within 100 meters. He ultimately decided to halt at 130 meters. The spear-wielding snowmen in the front row continued to dissipate, but Richardnell remained composed, relegating them to about 150 meters from the front before ordering his archers and mages to attack. Having traveled extensively for years, he had witnessed a combat of the strongest archery corps, the enchanted longbowman of the Kingdom of Angland. Heinz saw the enemy's magic shield suddenly vanish prematurely and immediately ordered everyone to halt and rearm it. Psyche, without holding back, rained down enchanted frost arrows at the enemy's normal enchanted longbowman strength, covering an area 130 to 200 meters in front of the position. The snowmen were well-mannered, the longbowmen drawing their bows in response to the officer's commands, and the mages enchanting their arrows. Heinz's mages were on their knees, their hearts throbbing. They hadn't expected the enemy to be serious, and could only grimly hold out. This was Richardnell's plan: ice cannons as bait, the immobile infantry as bait, waiting for the enemy to enter range before launching a blanket attack. Taking advantage of the enemy's suppression and the magic shield blocking his fire, he led the heavy infantry and spearmen in a surge. Bernd, who was flanking the enemy, broke into cold sweat and tried to maneuver his side further. He hadn't anticipated that this slight distance would allow the flanking regiment to escape danger. Richardnell and Psyche conferred, and ultimately, both agreed that Frederick couldn't do anything to them, so they summoned 500 more lightning rangers from the Kingdom of Gaul. Bernd was startled by the sudden surge of cavalry, but then, realizing it wasn't ice cavalry but rather fast light cavalry, he immediately ordered the entire regiment to form a hollow square on the ice. The lightning rangers were so fast that their speed was unaffected when they stepped onto the lake. Despite their spikes, the soldiers still stumbled. Frederick, surveying the battlefield from horseback, focused on the battle on the ice. They were the key to victory. His face darkened. The newly deployed light cavalry hadn't been part of his original plan, but what could he do? He couldn't defeat the two on the other side. Frederick feared most that the light cavalry would suddenly turn and launch a decapitation attack, leaving him without a fight. Judging by the speed of both sides, Bernd's airborne phalanx would likely be outmatched and be overwhelmed before it could even assemble. Just then, a company suddenly turned, bayonets fixed, and charged the oncoming cavalry. Snow burst from the lakeshore, halting the cavalry's charge. Bernd and his men took the opportunity to form an airborne phalanx. The magicians in the airborne phalanx immediately cast ice spikes as a roadblock, while the soldiers within fired volleys at the fast-moving enemy, causing their magical shields to glow with radiance. The lightning ranger cavalry scattered, seizing the opportunity to hurl snow spears at the phalanx. The battle on the lake had reached a stalemate, and direct support for the frontal battle was unavailable for a while. Jurgen finally managed to dispatch the ice cans. Their lethality was comparable to that of a snowball, but the ice was as hard as steel, and initially, he underestimated them and suffered a setback. If it weren't for his Wesson swordsmanship's exceptional close-range effectiveness, none of the ice cans would have been able to withstand the revolver's blast, and he might have been killed. Frederick immediately issued Jurgen his latest orders. Jurgen froze in his tracks and immediately turned with his cavalry, heading back into the snow-capped mountains. The mountains were difficult for heavy cavalry, but for the Wesson cavalry, equipped only with silver-scaled breastplates, they presented no significant challenge, and the mountains offered numerous paths. Richardnell, observing Jurgen and his men entering the mountains, was forced to divert some of his advancing spearmen to defend his right flank and the enchanted longbowmen to his rear. Frederick surveyed the battlefield. The strife continued on the lake, with the enemy's heavy infantry now within 80 meters of Heinz. He instructed his trumpeter to issue new orders. Richardner was a little confused when he heard the bugle call. Free charge? What was Frederick thinking? Chapter 127 The exercise ends. With the new orders, the battle on the ice was the first to break the deadlock. The Lightning Ranger cavalry launched another attack and then began to move toward the lakeshore, preparing to regroup for another attack. Bernd seized the opportunity and ordered the magician to disarm the ice spikes directly in front of them. The P Company in front of them, with bayonets raised, charged the cavalry. The P Companies on the other three sides followed behind, while the Cherry Company fired intercepting fire to prevent the cavalry from moving away. Without speed, the cavalry's lethality was greatly reduced. The charging soldiers were centered in groups of 4. The group leader, with his purple mushroom rifle, fired a close-range shot to penetrate the shield, while the other 3 men thrust their bayonets from 3 directions. The Lightning Ranger cavalry were quickly destroyed. Bernd did not halt his troops, but instead ordered the entire regiment to trot and continue the charge towards the enemy archer position. Elsewhere, Jurgen also launched his cavalry. Instead of circling the rear, his cavalry suddenly emerged from the mountains, targeting the spearmen returning to defend. The advancing spearmen were not far from the archer position. After being routed, The fleeing soldiers charged the archers, and Jurgen followed suit. With a ranged attack ceasing, Heinz immediately ordered Gerd to focus his magic shield on defending the top, leaving the sides open to provide the soldiers with an attack path. The Icecan heavy infantry were now less than 10 meters away. The front-line soldiers quickly emptied their magazines, reducing the foremost Icecans to snowdrift, throwing the spearmen behind them into disarray. With no time to fix their bayonets, the soldiers threw away their pea-shooters, unhooked their shovels, and charged forward. However, Psyche's snowmen were skilled fighters, outnumbered, and the soldiers, with less than a year's training, had no advantage. They relied on sheer ferocity and a refusal to admit defeat, even when killed, to maintain the tense situation. Frederick sent out his reserves, sending Franz the Younger and his company of drudgers to attack from the flank. Soon, Bernd and Jurgen dispatched the archers and magicians, turning back to surround the last of the spearmen. The outcome was assured. Frederick dismounted, stretched himself, and ate a lollipop. "How do you feel?" old Franz asked, grinning. He had been pondering how he would command the troops, only to find himself at a loss after the sudden appearance of the light cavalry. "All I want now is a good meal and a good night's sleep," Frederick said. If only I could take a hot bath. He had only issued a few orders, but this was no game. The slightest mistake could lead to complete collapse. He had to carefully consider every detail in a short period of time, which was mentally draining. Even after the drills, he shuddered to imagine what would happen in real combat. He told a messenger, "Go back and tell the barracks to prepare dinner and baths." When the army returned to camp, the aroma of stew could be smelled from afar. To eat, they needed a bath. The soldiers put away their weapons and equipment, took out their towels, and lined up at the bathroom. The bathroom was a large tent with a row of cauldrons in front, into which the miserable magicians were hurling fireballs. Each bathroom could accommodate a row of people at a time. Each person filled a bucket of hot water, and a can of soap paste sat on the side. From undressing to dressing, it took only 5 minutes. Undress, get wet, apply soap paste, rinse, dry, and get dressed. After the showers, everyone lined up for the dining area. Each person received a bowl of bean stew, a bowl of fresh vegetable soup, and half a pound of steamed bread. The menu said there would be sauerkraut and minced pork noodles before bed. As Metzger ate the stew, which was a mixture of fat and lean, he muttered, "This is such a good meal. I wonder if it's just to replenish our energy for another fight tomorrow." The next morning, "Metzger, why didn't you tell us yesterday that we were going to sleep in?" Metzger quietly dumped the dirt he had shoveled out in front of him and patted it down, ignoring the violent glances and complaints from those around him. Today's task was to build field fortifications. They had half an hour to dig foxholes. When the timer was up, a massive army would descend. While the task wasn't difficult, the psychological pressure was immense. No one wanted to be crushed by a giant pile of ice. Dinner was sweet radish stewed with beef, sweetened with grape vinegar, a deliciously sour and sweet treat. 2 hard-boiled eggs were also served. Metzger, peeling the eggs, had just said, "We'll have eggs today," when Popo, the man across from him, snarled, "Don't talk while you're eating." "Okay," Metzger said before swallowing the eggs. "I think we can stay put tomorrow." He heard everyone around him sigh in relief. However, more than 10 hours later, countless resentful glances were fixed on him. The third day's task was an ambush. The group would lie in wait in the snow in the morning, while the enemy would pass by the road below in the afternoon. To prevent unnecessary casualties, everyone was given a fur blanket to pad inside their winter sleeping bags, along with a heat pad. This heat pack has a combustion chamber in the middle and a water-filled layer on the outside. Charcoal inside heats the surrounding water, providing warmth for several hours. With this setup, even surrounded by snow, sleeping bags remain remarkably warm. However, a dozen men were deemed dead for snoring while asleep, and some only woke up after the battle began, resulting in insufficient firepower in the early stages. Dinner that day was braised pork elbow with sauerkraut. Everyone ate the elbow, and Metzger was so busy eating that he barely spoke. Just when everyone thought dinner was over, Metzger suddenly said, "I think we'll be able to return soon." Laughter filled the long dining table. Many had heard about his bad luck, and now that he said we could return to camp, they might actually be able to return after breakfast tomorrow. However, no one noticed the soon he mentioned. At dawn, the emergency assembly whistle blew. Tonight's exercise was the final one of the exercise, a night march through the mountains, with the target being the military camp. Everyone removed their night running lights, attached them to their helmets, and headed into the mountains, following the signposts. Frederick was also in the team. He said to little Franz beside him, "The latest news is that the neighbors will recruit militia during the slack season after spring plowing and before summer harvest. The day of the war will be then. During this period, you must sum up your experience, carry out targeted training, do a good job of education, and prepare for the next war. I judge that there will be 4 enemy forces attacking us at the same time, and the strongest is from Count Ansbach. So the city of Hausen in front of us must rely on the city defense forces and militia to hold them back, and the main force will eliminate them after eliminating the enemies in the other 3 directions. You must make a good plan and let all places do a good job of logistics, so as not to be in a hurry when the time comes. Since the guests are here, just stay. This time we will fight a battle of annihilation and a battle of defense. We will strive to eliminate the enemy's resistance in one battle. Our goal is to expand our territory. Soldiers these days are all workers. As long as the boss is killed and the new boss is useless, they will run away immediately." This time everyone was at loggerheads, so Frederick had no moral principles and first physically eliminated the enemy leaders, and then swallowed up the land. After the fait accompli, he was not afraid to bring the case to the Pope. Chapter 128, Lure the Tiger Away from the Mountain. As the weather grew warmer, tensions in Wessenland grew. Wessenland enacted a new grain law, stipulating that the average price of staple grain for the same month of the previous year would be the guiding price, with a maximum selling price of 20% above the guiding price. The Lord had the right to forcibly purchase all grain within the territory at 105% of the guiding price, if necessary. Many grain merchants in Wessenland had hoarded large quantities of grain, anticipating a post-war surge in prices. But now, Baron Wesson had preemptively upended the situation. Fortunately, it was the lean season for winter wheat, and grain prices were high, so everyone decided to cash in while they could. Frederick, rather than embarrass these merchants, gave them vouchers granting them priority access to goods at the Wesson family's factories. It was common knowledge that local specialties like bearings, paper, insect repellent, glassware, and clothes drying racks often had waiting lists of at least 3 months. Vouchers that allowed them to skip the lines fetched a 30% premium on the market, and even double the price for in-demand goods. Merchants were driven by profit, and Frederick underestimated their integrity. Fearing that their local specialties would be unable to be shipped out if war broke out, and that they might never be available again, they began exchanging grain for vouchers. Frederick received reports of grain sacks with labels bearing names like Ries, Ansbach, and Roth. Later, some even resold military rations to Wesson. Suspicious, Frederick asked Friedrich to inspect the rations for poison, but they were found to be safe. Warehouses around the port were overflowing with goods, awaiting the thaw of the rivers for shipping. However, as the 2 rivers leading to Wesson thawed, several cargo ships laden with stone accidentally sank near the border, blocking the waterway. However, that same night, the sunken ships were destroyed by a mysterious force, restoring the waterway. Rumors circulated that it was the swordmaster Richardner himself who had wrought the destruction. Soon, the neighbors of Wessenland began building roads, all connected to the main thoroughfare leading to Wessenland, just a few dozen meters from the territory. For a time, trade routes were cut off. Frederick was left with no alternative. Even building a wall around their own land was no problem, let alone a road. A few days later, the situation escalated further. Edward, a master craftsman of the Nuremberg Stonemasons Guild and head of the Carolina Canal construction team, sent a letter through a side road. The new mayor of Nuremberg forbade the Stonemasons Guild from sending workers to Wessenland to participate in the canal excavation. Frederick replied, telling Edward not to worry, saying the problem wasn't his fault. The current tense situation meant the canal construction could be put on hold until things calmed down. As spring plowing began, an unexpected turn of events unfolded. A guest from the Kingdom of Sardinia arrived at the castle, specifically requesting to see Richard Lancati. While he looked like an ordinary farmer, Frederick sensed a sense of danger. The man's eyes seemed dull, but he was studying Frederick intently, a touch of curiosity about the young man. Bored while waiting, he decided to play a trick on Frederick, so he silently slipped a throwing knife from his sleeve into his hand. However, the knife stopped mid-slide as a faceless figure in a white robe suddenly appeared behind him, a hidden blade protruding from his wrist, poised at Frederick's neck. A cold sweat broke out on the guest's forehead. Confident in his stealth and assassination skills, He had carefully observed his surroundings from the outset, unaware of anyone lurking. He could only slowly retract the throwing knife, but then something even more terrifying happened. It's difficult for someone to appear silently, but it's even harder to disappear silently after being discovered. He didn't even notice how the person behind him left, they simply vanished. The living room door had been ajar, and the windows were open, but the white gauze curtains hung quietly. Frederick picked up his teacup, took a sip nonchalantly, and then said calmly, "If you're bored, you can look for him." He rarely used the elemental puppet Psyche had given him. He had only just released the assassin after noticing unusual activity, and it seemed he'd frightened him. This was also why he usually went out without bodyguards. With his current strength, he could keep 4 elemental puppets at full strength for 5 minutes, more than enough to solve the problem. At that moment, the living room door opened, and Richardner and Katie walked in together, their murderous auras radiating from them. Upon seeing the guest, they froze, their aura instantly vanishing. Katie sat down next to Frederick and said to her guest with a smile, "So it's you, the shark." She then introduced him to Frederick. His code name is Old Shark. He's the best assassin in the Freedom Society and one of the top 5 in the world. Old Shark quickly replied humbly, "I don't take such a reputation for granted. Compared to Baron Wessen's bodyguards, I'm just a nobody." Katie and Richardner wondered if Frederick had other bodyguards around him. But they were quickly relieved. Everyone has their own hidden weapons. "What's going on?" Katie's eyes suddenly sharpened. "What do you want to do?" To have forced Frederick's hidden bodyguards out, he must have done something dangerous. A little awkwardly, Old Shark raised his right hand and slowly pulled a throwing knife from his sleeve. The knife had a thin wire at the end. He said, "I was just trying to frighten Baron Wessen." "Huh? How dare you bully Frederick?" Katie was furious. "I'll write to your wife and tell her where your lover is." "Don't." The Old Shark panicked and said pitifully, "Katie, please forgive me for the sake of my uncle and his people supporting your opera." Katie snorted coldly and didn't reply. Richardner seemed to dislike this man and asked him with a hint of anger, "Who ordered you to kidnap Mafia?" The Old Shark answered cautiously, "Our guests didn't say who they were, but they gave us gold florins, brand new, without a scratch." This clue was enough. It wouldn't be difficult to find out who in the Rhine Confederation had recently minted so many gold coins. Richardner asked again, "How much did they give?" The Old Shark replied, 500. Frederick was surprised. 500 florins was no small sum. The other party had spent so much to kidnap Katie's mother, which meant the profit was far greater. Richardner continued to ask the Old Shark, "How much did Mafia ask for?" The Old Shark sighed helplessly, 300. "Alice, these days, hostages get more than the kidnappers. Is there any justice in this world?" Frederick blinked. What was going on? Richardner asked again, "What are your demands? How dare we ask for anything?" The Old Shark cried out in indignation. "Of course, an extra 50 gold coins would be best. Here's a letter from your wife." He pulled a cloth bag from his bosom, took out a letter, and presented it to Richardner with both hands. Frederick noticed that the envelope and the letter paper inside were new products from the paper mill last year. It must have been sent by Katie. As Richardner read the letter, Katie asked him, "Where are you holding my mother?" "Don't say such terrible things," the Old Shark said hurriedly. "We're inviting you to Ischia for a vacation. Oh, by the way, my lady asked me to ask around here to see if you've found a partner. If you have, to find out what kind of person he is, his moral character, how many acres of land he owns, how many floors his house has, and how many horses his carriage has." Katie's face darkened as she listened, and she pouted. Richardner finished reading the letter and handed it to Frederick. Frederick took it and began to read. It was written in Sardinian, which he could barely understand. Katie leaned over, her face darkening even more. Mafia had only one thing to say to Richardner in the letter: "It's not a good idea for our daughter to be unmarried at this age. Let's have another child this year." Richardner asked Frederick, "What do you think?" Frederick pinched his chin and replied, "My master's wife is old. She needs to have a detailed physical examination when she is pregnant. She needs to ensure a balanced diet, good living habits, and a good attitude." Katie knocked his head hard, sat there angrily, turned her head to look out the window and said nothing. It was very clear that if the enemy wanted to attack Wesson County, Richardner must be transferred first. No matter what the process was, as long as the Sword Saint left, it would be fine. This was all in the plan, and we just had to follow the steps. However, the acting had to be done in full. Richardner said to the Old Shark, I won't make it difficult for you. I'll give you 10 seconds to run first. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 129, New Family Crest. This spring, the rain had been incessant for 4 or 5 days. As soon as the sun shone for a day, the thick clouds began to scatter raindrops again, and it looked like the rain wouldn't stop for another 2 or 3 days. On the 5th day after Richardnell's departure, a group disembarked at the dock and, flying brightly colored banners, entered Wissenberg. As they reached the square, their flags drooped wetly from their poles. The leading wizards' robes were soaked with water. The knights behind them could only endure the icy rain soaking through their armor. Their horses snorted occasionally, completely lacking the spirited energy they had displayed in the royal capital. Frederick, dressed in traditional attire, stood quietly at the castle gates, watching the group creep forward at a tortoise-like pace. Behind him, all the civil and military officials arrived, their faces etched with expressions ranging from indifference to anger and sullenness. Judge Otto and police officer Dominic, in particular, gnashed their teeth, their eyes blazing with anger. The messenger team from the capital finally arrived in front of the castle. The leader, Heinrich, the deputy commander of the Royal Mage Corps, dismounted, took a golden mailbox from a servant, and walked in front of Frederick. Alice, he sighed, covered his face with one hand, and handed the mailbox to Frederick with the other, saying, "You read it yourself." "I'm embarrassed to read it." Behind him, the knights were studying the dark clouds in the sky or the flowers and plants around them, not daring to look directly at the people of Wesson. Frederick quietly took the mailbox and said calmly, "Your Excellency and everyone else have worked hard. Please go to the castle to change clothes and rest. You will attend the banquet later." "Alice," Heinrich sighed again, "I'm sorry to bother you." Afu immediately stepped forward and invited Heinrich and the knights into the castle to take a shower and change clothes. Frederick looked at the coat of arms on the mailbox in his hand. It was from the Heraldry Academy. The Heraldry Chamber was the king's agency responsible for managing his vassal states. It was where the king issued decrees regarding nobility titles, rewards, and punishments. The last time Frederick received a decree from the king through them was when the Wesson family was demoted from earldom to baron. This decree had arrived the day before yesterday through other channels. Frederick took a look, and the contents were identical to those in the intelligence report. He then handed it to the group behind him. Everyone was furious at the king's latest decree, unable to contain their outbursts. Frederick simply sneered and said nothing more. King William first brought up the matter of Frederick's father. The original 5,000 florin fine was increased to 8,000 florins, with Heinrich demanding half of it be returned. Then came the climax. William, citing Frederick's unauthorized killing of a noble, decreed that the Wesson family's coat of arms be stripped of their original coat of arms. The new coat of arms could only use 2 colors, and no images of worldly objects could be used. The first was a robbery, the second a slap in the face. A family's coat of arms represents the family's image, showcasing its identity, honor, and territorial character. The longer the family's history, the higher its status, and the more complex and ornate its coat of arms. Now, the king has stripped the Wessons of their original coat of arms and restricted the colors and content of their new coat of arms, all the while declaring their baronial status and knighthood. Master, Otto looked at Frederick, his hands trembling as he held the parchment, his eyes reddened. The reason for the Wessons' stripping of their coat of arms stemmed from last year's Chapper case, where Frederick had executed the nobleman as a commoner. While the case involved considerable shady dealings, the entire process appeared flawless, with the lawyers on both sides presenting impeccable defenses, drawing on numerous sources. Otto was always proud of the case, even organizing a book detailing its entire story and analyzing each point in the defense. Now, something he was so proud of had become a weapon used to attack his master, leaving him feeling deeply distressed. Frederick saw his thoughts and asked earnestly, "If this trial could be repeated, would you uphold the original verdict?" Otto answered without hesitation, "Yes, so would I," Frederick said. "Wolves don't need a reason to eat sheep. Without this one, they'll find another, but the fruits of our labor can't be taken away by a piece of parchment. What we need to do now is unite and show those evil wolves that we are not lambs to be slaughtered." Heinrich didn't rest. Instead, he quietly watched Frederick and the others' reactions from behind the main gate of the castle, listening to their conversation with his ear. He didn't hide it from anyone, and Alfu stood quietly by. Afu, Heinrich asked, how old is your master this year? Afu replied calmly, as many as you have fingers. Heinrich sighed, raised his head and looked at the dark clouds rolling with spring thunder, and whispered, in the blink of an eye, we are all old. Do you still remember that day when we talked about our ideals by the campfire? That was many years ago, Afu replied. Back then you were still a virgin who had never even touched a girl's hand, and now you are the grandfather of 2 grandsons. Heinrich smiled and sighed. I have accomplished nothing in all these years, and the position of deputy captain was given to me just for today's matter. The future will be the time of young people, and I should find a place to retire. Afu said, we have said long ago that you are not suitable for the intrigue-ridden Royal Mage Corps. You are more suitable for studying like Diesel. You can come to teach at the Master's University. With your knowledge, maybe in a few years you can decide how much bonus to give Diesel. Yes, Diesel's here too. Heinrich's eyes narrowed slightly. We still haven't avenged the bombing of our food supply, forcing us to cook our shoes and belts for 3 days. He changed the subject, asking, can Baron Wesson win this battle? Afu sneered and replied confidently, if all of you, the royal mages, come, we'll lose gracefully. Go get some rest. Do you still think you're old enough to walk in the rain for 3 days and 3 nights? Heinrich turned and followed Afu to the bathroom, saying helplessly, we're different from His Majesty. We still have dignity. That evening, Frederick hosted a banquet for Heinrich and his party. The castle's dining room was brightly lit. The original Wesson family crest on the wall behind the main seat was removed and replaced with a new one, which had been hurriedly produced the day before. Frederick was quite open-minded about the change of family crest. So be it. The crest carries family history, and the Wesson family's new history will be forged by themselves. Even if the new coat of arms only had 2 colors and a simple design, as long as the Wesson family became powerful, everyone would regard it as majestic and extraordinary. This is the new coat of arms of the Wesson family head, Frederick said to Heinrich and the others, pointing to the heraldic banner. Does it meet the king's requirements? Heinrich and the others' mouths twitched. They had initially expected Baron Wesson to be furious, tearful, and at a loss, but they hadn't expected him to legally and legitimately slap the king in the face. The original Wesson family coat of arms featured a white castle, a blue river, and an eagle, representing the royal lineage of the Second Purian Empire. The new coat of arms still had a red background, with a golden eagle, representing the royal lineage, as the main element. The eagle's outstretched wings were composed of 8 radiating lines of varying lengths on each side. Its chest was covered with 12 feathers in 4 rows and 3 columns, and below them were 3 tail feathers and 5 claws. To better comply with the standard of no worldly objects in the design, the eagle had 2 heads, each looking left and right, and a crest with 2 feathers on each side. Everyone was unsure what the various parts of the new coat of arms represented. They only knew that the eagle in the Rhine Confederation's coat of arms represented ancient royal heritage. The Wesson family's royal heritage was recognized by the previous king. Frederick's great-grandfather, driven from his homeland, brazenly sought refuge with a previous king. Initially, the eagle wasn't considered appropriate for the family crest, but it was the king who added it, even adding the title of Earl. Consequently, the first Wesson counts worked tirelessly in the south, and over several generations, Wesson County grew from a single town to its current 5 cities. King William and Frederick were of the same generation. Frederick's use of the eagle as the new coat of arms for the Wesson family was seen by many as a sign of the king's approval and favor, a testament to the Wesson family's loyalty to the throne. This, in contrast to the current king's actions, was a profound irony. Heinrich replied, the new coat of arms fully meets the requirements. The others agreed. After everyone was seated, before the dishes were served, Frederick said, I don't have that much money, but I can use other treasures instead. Afu brought a gilded plate over and gently placed it in front of Heinrich. Heinrich looked at the golden beans before him, reached out to pick one up, and discovered it was a plant seed. Frederick began to lie openly, these are precious beans I bought from Teo Huishi. Do you think they can be used to pay off the debt? The skin of the golden pumpkin turns the water golden when boiled. Concentrated, it can be used for dyeing, though the color fades over time. The 2 pounds of soybeans on the plate were dyed, looking brilliantly golden. As for whether William would use them for planting or grinding pumpkin-flavored soy milk, it was up to him. If he couldn't grow golden beans, he could just blame their technology. Besides, when the beans matured, Frederick would either lose everything and flee, or swallow up the territories of his neighbors, greatly increasing his power. No one would dare to underestimate him. Heinrich immediately replied, "Of course, I think His Majesty will be pleased." His intuition told him something was amiss, but he didn't bother to worry. He simply took the items back and completed the task. Frederick's lips curled slightly as he instructed the maids to bring in the roasted whole lamb, sprinkled with cumin powder. The aroma immediately filled the dining room. Chapter 130 Pre-War Propaganda. Although we don't want to encounter them, it's difficult to avoid the covetousness of the bandits. There's no way around it. The peace of our homeland doesn't depend on servility to the bandits, but on strength. Those around us, Count Reese, Count Eichstadt, Count Ansbach, Count Firth, Count Roth, are dreaming of robbing us of our last copper, raping our families, and then pointing their fingers at our bones and saying, "Look, a slave." That's why no one wants to rely on their mercy for the safety of their homeland. We must unite, gather all our strength and seize it in our hands, ready to strike the invaders hard when they arrive, otherwise we will only perish in defeat. Since 1024, our security has been under serious threat. The current major problems cannot be solved by compromise and concessions. Today they dare to extort 2 kreuts from everyone, tomorrow they will dare to extort 2 florins. The only way to solve our security problems is with iron and blood. Under the bright spring sun, several students from the University of Wessenland parked a carriage in the square of Lingen. One of them stood on the carriage's roof, holding a megaphone and giving a speech to the citizens, while several others distributed leaflets. Heinrich had been assigned to gather information in Wessenland, and Frederick had sent him on a tour. That day, he arrived in Lingen, 20 kilometers east of Wessenberg. A small river ran through the city, and the surrounding flat farmland made it a major grain producer in Wessenland. Lingen, newly upgraded from a town to a city, was relatively small, with a population of only around 2,000. It was Sunday, and the square was filled with stalls. Many villagers from the surrounding area would buy some food after attending church services. The crowd, captivated by the student's speech, quickly surrounded the carriage in several layers, and soon erupted in angry roars. Heinrich listened quietly from the outside of the crowd. His accent didn't sound like someone from Wessenland, but his impassioned tone and angry demeanor were exactly like those of the locals. The content of the speech was identical to the article Frederick had written in the Wesenzeitung 2 days earlier, with some colloquial embellishments. A female student approached Heinrich. Like the rest of her classmates, she was dressed in the Wesen University uniform, a white shirt and a light gray blazer. The boys wore straight-leg pants, the girls a pleated skirt, exuding youthful energy. Because Heinrich was wearing the traditional scholar's robe, the girl saluted and said, "Excuse me, sir. Would you like a flyer?" Heinrich, recognizing her Constantine accent, took the flyer and asked, "Are you from Constantine, too?" The girl simply smiled politely, her eyes filled with sadness, and didn't answer. Feeling as if he had broached a topic he shouldn't have, Heinrich took the flyer and asked, "Excuse me, what does that badge on your collar mean?" Pinned to the left side of the girl's collar was a round copper badge with an open book below and something that looked like a palette above. Her eyes immediately lit up, a smile from the heart appeared on her face, and she said happily, "This is an art teacher qualification badge, which means that I can be an art teacher in elementary school. I passed the exam with great difficulty." Heinrich saw that she was like a child showing off a baby, and said with a smile, "Then I should call you professor." "How can I?" The girl felt a little embarrassed. "Only scholars who teach at universities can become professors." Heinrich nodded, asked about the income of university professors, and sought a way out for himself. "Professors' salaries aren't very high," the girl replied. "But if you have the talent, you can build your own factory or partner with others, and you can earn more." My boyfriend is Professor Manuel's student. He originally studied necromancy with the intention of joining the army, but now he's taken out a loan to open a cannery. He expects to earn over 200 florins a year, and it's not as dangerous as going to war. Heinrich hurriedly asked, "How much?" "How much a year?" He suspected he had misheard. An average wizard in the Royal Magus Corps earned only 200 florins a year, while an outstanding wizard earned 300 florins, equivalent to a baron. A skilled wizard like himself earned 500 florins, about the same as the Wesson family before, and that money came at the cost of his life. "Over 200 florins, the girl replied. "But after paying off the loans for the first 10 years, there's less than 200 left." We can't compare it to the others." She then went on to recount the recent earnings of other professors and students, a fact not unknown at the University of Wessenberg. Heinrich fell silent, took the flyer, and left. The day before yesterday, he'd tried to break Diesel's wallet by treating him to a lavish dinner, using the incident of being blown up in the cave as an excuse. Instead, the meal turned into a display of wealth, with expensive spices from the south sprinkled throughout, wine at least 50 years old, and, even worse, a gold chain weighing at least a kilogram. As for himself, Heinrich sighed, letting go of the thought, and began to read the flyer. It had a red background and colorful figures. The top section featured 5 busts of men and women holding new Wesson weapons. From their clothing, they showed soldiers in uniform, farmers in hoods and straw hats, workers in blacksmith uniforms, businessmen or clerks in suits and top hats, and students in school uniforms. Below, black silhouettes of defeated soldiers appeared. The large letters at the top suggested a call to action for the Minutemen. Heinrich had been reading old Wesson newspapers lately and figured the Minutemen were a kind of militia conscription, but they didn't have to leave their home region, saving on supplies and the cost. He and the other knights who had come with him had used the weapons these militiamen used at a shooting range. After entering 1026, Wessenland opened several shooting ranges, offering folding rifles to citizens and hunters interested in joining the Minutemen. Shooting courses consisted of 20 classes, including 5 covering theory, safety, legal procedures, and maintenance. Passing the exam resulted in a license, which allowed the purchase of a firearm. Wessenland also enacted a new weapons law, requiring citizens to fold their guns and store them in a special bag when carrying them in public. Many had seen the soldiers carrying these new weapons during military exercises, and after the city defense forces began equipping them, they became increasingly visible. As a result, the shooting ranges attracted considerable attention upon their opening. Naturally, various factions sent personnel to study them, and Heinrich and his team also tried them out. Their conclusion was that these weapons had comparable range to bows and arrows, were more powerful, and had similar reload speeds. However, the materials were prohibitively expensive, costing 4 florins after government subsidies, making them impractical for large-scale deployment. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief, but Heinrich felt that this weapon required far less effort than bows and arrows, and if deployed en masse and used in concentrated fashion, its power would be considerable. Of course, that presumably meant having the money to do so en masse. With the current state of affairs, many in Wesson County wanted to purchase this new weapon. Although many couldn't afford 4 florins immediately, Wesson Bank offered interest-free loans for 1 to 5 years and low-interest loans for 6 to 10 years to licensed locals. Long lines formed at the shooting range and the bank. Heinrich felt that if citizens and farmers were equipped with this weapon en masse, it would be beneficial for the city's defense. However, siege warfare these days was primarily a siege, and without a city's food supply, nothing would matter. Heinrich wandered around the square for a while and noticed a newly erected stage and wooden benches in a corner. Curious, he went over to take a look. Chapter 131 New Opera. Loyalty is the most sacred virtue. Heinrich sighed deeply upon hearing these words, and a bearded merchant sitting to his right wiped away tears. Although the characters in the play didn't mention their last names, everyone knew who they were referring to. Count Henry von Wesson, in his final moments, cried these words, burning with his life in an attempt to perish alongside his enemies. This opera has now made them known to the public. The students who had been giving the lecture and distributing flyers were also attending the opera. They sat to Heinrich's left, and one of the boys said, 2 years ago, Professor Manuel arranged for us to visit Monsignor Just and the other parties involved in the battle in order to recreate every detail of the battle in the opera. These lines were spoken by old Count Wesson in his final moments. The bearded merchant, upon hearing the boy's words, immediately asked, "Teacher, what did the old Count say in his final moments?" Earlier, the actor playing old Wesson on stage had seemed about to say something after collapsing, but the words remained. "Sorry, I don't know." The boy shook his head regretfully. "Master Juster," said the old Count, waved his hand to speak, but didn't get the chance. The bearded merchant sighed helplessly. During the intermission, many in the audience discussed the old Count's final words. Some said he saw an angel coming to take him away, others said he wanted to call out the old lady or the young master's name, and some said he wanted to curse his enemies to have children without buttocks. Those who knew him well believed he had seen the Milky Way near heaven and wanted to take advantage of it. This theory was universally refuted and seemed quite plausible. Many had seen him frequently fishing in the swamps north of Lingen. Heinrich remained silent. The first act of today's opera depicted the first Count of Wesseland, who defected to the late queen and expanded her territory. The second act depicted Frederick's father, who sacrificed his life protecting the logistics base. A truly loyal family, the plot of the third act could be vaguely guessed. Sure enough, the third act began with the king and crown prince's misguided command on the front lines leading to a crushing defeat, followed by a gathering of defeated generals to discuss how to shift the blame. The actor playing the king was incompetent, his lines were poorly delivered and he occasionally forgot them, making him look like an idiot. Even deliberate acting wouldn't have been as effective. Heinrich watched this scene with great attention, having participated in the war as a member of the Royal Mages, and he breathed a sigh of relief at the end when they had no role to play. The second half of Act III concluded with the villains invading the Loyalists' territories, raping and pillaging along the way. The plot, so synced with real events, left the audience feeling gloomy, and almost no one spoke during the intermission. A roar like thunder, a roar like waves, a clash of swords. Our homeland, who will protect it? Act IV began with passionate song. The first half, depicting the expulsion of the invaders, thrilled the audience, but the second half, depicting the king's attempt, after defeat, to find a random woman to adopt as his goddaughter and marry the victor to achieve his goal, which he had failed to achieve on the battlefield, left the audience gnashing their teeth. After watching the opera, Heinrich decided to ask the students at the University of Wessenland what the requirements were for applying to the university. He understood warfare and knew full well how difficult it was to defeat a united territory and a cohesive army. The current propaganda campaign was only the beginning. As the campaign progressed, the expressions of the audience would reveal the true nature of the enemy facing the Lord's armies. When the emotions of the entire territory were galvanized, perhaps only the God of Light knew the kind of foe those Lord's armies would face. As for getting the people of the territory to betray Baron Wesson and Massey, such a possibility was unthinkable. Just look at the long line of carriages outside the hatchery selling chicks and chicken feed. Villagers could obtain low-interest loans to buy chicks and feed. After 3 months, the feed-to-meat ratio of the broilers would decrease. They would produce less meat on the same amount of feed, making it uneconomical to continue feeding them. When the chicks were nearly grown, they could be sold. The proceeds from the chicken sales could be used to pay off the interest and then purchase another batch of chicks and feed. If the debtor's accumulated interest payments exceeded double the loan principal within the agreed time frame, the interest would be suspended and the principal would be repaid until the principal was fully repaid. The same low-interest loans could also be used to purchase high-yield wheat seeds, fertilizer, and farm tools. However, these loans weren't direct cash payments, but rather vouchers for targeted consumption, so they couldn't be used for other purposes. Compared to the often bankrupt usury offered by other lords, this type of loan was enough to make a name for oneself. Heinrich wandered around the city for a while, found a hotel, and upon opening the window, he saw a construction site behind him. Even after dark, the work continued with a steady thrum. Heinrich had no choice but to go to the tavern downstairs, where he ordered a beer and some snacks. He took the opportunity to ask the owner, "When will the train stop?" The owner replied, "Soon." Around 10 o'clock in the evening, Heinrich took a sip of his wine and asked, "What are they building over there?" "A school," the owner replied. "It's almost finished, and students will be able to go to class in the summer." Heinrich asked in surprise, "It's so big, how many students will there be?" The owner scratched his head and replied, "I don't know. Anyway, any child of sufficient age in an area as big as Lingen City and the village below can come to school. The children go to school during the day, and there are classes at night. I've signed up my wife for math lessons to prevent her from making mistakes all the time." Heinrich, like many outsiders, was shocked and asked in disbelief, "So farmers' children can go to school too? Can they afford it?" "Not much," the owner opened up and said proudly, "A year's tuition is only the price of 2.5 chickens. Many people can afford it. We locals don't have to pay taxes or tuition to the master. The teachers are government employees, paid by the government, and don't charge students. But lunch does cost money. Hey, I make lunch for the students here too. A meal costs 4 coppers, but the children only have to pay half. The rest comes from government tax cuts and subsidies, church donations, donations from wealthy families in the city, and milk from the dairy. We can't do it haphazardly. There are daily regulations for staple food, meat, and vegetables, and we can't use bad or inferior products. The church priests come to check every day. It's not much money, but it's a good reputation. When those kids grow up, won't they come to me for a drink? Ho ha ho ha. These days, inns and taverns are long-standing establishments passed down from generation to generation, their owners planning for the long term. Heinrich smiled and echoed a few words, feeling a surge of emotion. As a magician, he had seen too many people with magical talent who were unable to learn for various reasons, the biggest being lack of money. Children here now go to school almost free of charge. According to the education section of the Wesson Daily, after extensive screening, talented children are not missed. If Wesson County can survive this war, this policy can continue. Heinrich didn't dare to think about it in another 20 years. Frederick, in his prime, has thousands of magicians under his command. Perhaps no one in the world can stop him. Chapter 132. The prince steps out. The spring sunshine was so short-lived, and the sky continued to be overcast and rainy. In a royal estate outside Cologne, a silk awning was set up over the fields. King William half sat and half reclined on a soft, comfortable recliner, personally watching the farmers plant golden beans in the fields. The farmland was heavily guarded, with a guard every 3 steps and a sentry every 5 steps, and no outsiders were allowed to approach. Soon, a young man in his early 20s, dressed in elegant attire, rode over on a silver-white unicorn, jumped off not far from the silk awning, and strode over to William's side. "Father." Crown Prince Rudolph's greeting was textbook standard. William pointed to the chair beside him and gestured, causing all the attendants to withdraw. Someone also cast a soundproofing spell. Rudolph sat upright in his chair, his eyes fixed on the farmland before him. William glanced at his son, sighed, and then asked, "Do you know why I called you back?" Rudolph immediately replied, "It's about these golden beans." William snorted coldly, which made the prince nervous instantly. "You will lead the troops to attack Wesson in half a month," the king said calmly. "Nominally you will command the entire army, but everyone will listen to Ansbach. There is only one thing you have to do nothing, just keep your mouth shut in the army and wait for the war to be over." After hearing this, Rudolph opened his mouth and wanted to say something, but in the end he didn't say it. "Just ask if you have anything you want to ask." William was a little helpless. His son's character was too weak. He would be scared if he was a little strict. Rudolph asked cautiously, "Father, why do we have to attack Wesson? He is just a child." William slowly closed his eyes, his breathing a little heavier than usual. Cold sweat suddenly broke out on Rudolph's forehead. His father was angry, and he would be scolded next. "Alice," William sighed deeply with his eyes closed, and said softly, "If there was a girl of the right age in the royal family, I would make her the heir to the throne and then marry Wesson, but no. You are the only heir, so the only way is to get rid of Wesson." Rudolph let the sweat on his head flow to his cheeks, not daring to speak, for fear of saying something wrong again. William continued with his eyes closed, 3 years ago, because you underestimated the enemy and advanced rashly, we lost the war and lost the entire lowland area, which dealt a great blow to your reputation. You will sit in my position in the future. A king can be greedy, lustful, cruel, and mediocre, but he must never lose the war. Even if it's a fire dragon, as long as it has a wound on its body, wild dogs dare to bare their fangs at it. Why should I put the blame of the defeat on old Wesson? Isn't it because little Wesson is still young and can't argue, so as to cover up your mistake, although everyone else knows that it was your fault? As long as you push the responsibility away, people will admit it after a long time, and you will be innocent. It's just that I didn't expect it. Wesson actually survived. What were you doing when you were that age? What was I doing when I was that age? He is like this now. In another 30 years, or even 20 years, I'm afraid the position of king will become his." Rudolph looked at his father in surprise and said in disbelief, "He won't be like this, will he?" William suddenly opened his eyes and stared at his son, his face flushed with anger. "Look at what is planted in this field," the king roared loudly. "Do you really think he is the only one doing business with that pagan? For a family, money is important. When necessary, reputation and honor can be temporarily abandoned. As long as the strength is still there, they will come back sooner or later. If he really had sent the money, even if it wasn't that much, I would have spared his life." Attitude. Listen carefully. Attitude. For a monarch, the attitude of his subjects is the most important thing. He dares to play tricks on the king now. When he's powerful enough, what can't he do? The temperature was not high in the drizzling spring season, and a gentle breeze brought a cool breeze. Rudolph had already risen from his chair, head bowed like a child who had done something wrong, sweat covering his head and body more than if he had been standing under the scorching sun. William felt extremely helpless, but he had to continue teaching his only son. Everyone has strengths and weaknesses. Your weakness is that you're not strong enough. Your strength is that you listen to others, but you can be overwhelmed when faced with so many choices. For this expedition, I will arrange for the sons of other families to form a royal knight order to accompany you. You must learn to distinguish among them those with real talent and those who are useless, and those who have special skills. When you are a king, you can leave many things to your wise ministers, let them give you advice and help you analyze things, and you only need to make the final decision. You have to pay attention to one thing. This war is entirely decided by Ansbach. You can talk about it, and you can also give him suggestions, but it is up to him to decide whether to adopt them or not. You have no right to interfere with his decision. Do you understand? William's tone was extremely stern when he said the last sentence, as if he would jump up and hit Rudolph if he had the slightest doubt. Rudolph didn't dare to question it, and it was too late to agree. Then he mustered up the courage to ask a question. Father, since Wesson is so outstanding, why don't you let him do the work? William turned his head abruptly to look at his son. His expression did not change, but his eyes became much softer. He was happy that his son finally proposed something reliable. Very good, William said with relief. Since you have this idea, then do it. To this end, I will agree to any conditions you propose for him, even if it means kneeling in front of him to admit my mistake. The king was very pleased. The prince's idea was very good. It didn't matter if he couldn't govern the country. As long as he saw talented people and recruited them for his own use, the royal family could continue. William did not deny that Frederick was a genius, so he forced him to death when they had already torn their faces. If his son could really subdue him, the age difference between the two was not that big, and they would definitely be a powerful force in the future. What did it matter if he lost face for his son's future? Father, Rudolph's face turned pale. The king personally knelt down to admit his mistake to the vassal. There was no precedent in history books. William continued, before you leave, take the edict of the Heraldry Academy with you. If Wesson is willing to submit to you, you can confer the title of Duke on him on the spot. He is a child who will be very happy to get such a high title and will definitely be loyal to you, Duke. Rudolph widened his eyes. Isn't this too high? William sneered and began to explain the truth to his son. Titles are empty, but strength is real. The Grand Duke of Mainz is restless, and the Grand Duke of Bavaria is also restless. Nuremberg is in such a mess now that it is hard to tell what is going on, and we can't rely on it. After this battle, Wesson has completely fallen out with his neighbors, and there will definitely be wars in the future. Wesson is very close to the Duchy of Mainz. If he becomes the Grand Duke, what will the other side think? The Wittelsbach family has already become enemies with Wesson because of the Chapper incident. With the Duchy of Bavaria as an enemy, and without the support of the Duchy of Mainz, Wesson will have a hard time. Who do you think Wesson can rely on at that time? Rudolph replied immediately, Wesson can only rely on us at that time. William nodded with satisfaction. The South was already in chaos, and it didn't matter if it continued to be chaotic. On the contrary, it would be beneficial to the royal family, and it would be best if he could teach his son a good lesson. Rudolph then said with some concern, but what if Wesson runs away? He never thought that he would lose, and the same went for William. William smiled triumphantly and whispered, there are many magicians in Wesson now. Heinrich is already lurking there, and Lord Beecher has also brought most of the Royal Mage Corps to Wessenberg City to lurk. When the time comes, you can send someone to contact Lord Beecher, keep an eye on Wesson, and capture him alive when necessary. I've agreed with them that the books that the Wesson family brought back from Constantinople will be divided among them. A smile appeared on Rudolph's face. Lord Beecher is the head of the Royal Mage Corps, known as the Burning God of Magic. He is good at fire magic and alchemy. With him taking action, there is no need to worry even if Richardnal comes back. The two father and son didn't know that at this moment. Beecher and a group of members of the Royal Mage Corps surrounded Frederick aggressively, as if they were going to spank him if they disagreed. Chapter 133 You Can't Make Money. 5,000 florins. Beecher, the burning mage with curly white hair, nearly spit it into Frederick's hand. Fiery eyes wasn't an adjective but an objective description. Frederick remained calm. He was used to masters of his level losing their temper in his presence. He'd been furious when he'd questioned a swordmaster's fish purchase at the market. 5,000 florins, Beecher gritted his teeth. Wilhelm only gives me 1,500 florins a year, and you gave Heinrich 5,000 florins. Heinrich sat far away in a chair in the corner of the living room, two wooden boxes, one large and one small, at his feet. He leisurely sipped his tea from a teacup. He had written a report on everything he'd seen and heard in Wessenland and sent it back to the royal mages. He emphasized a vast library at Wessenberg University and expressed his concern that these precious books would be destroyed in the war. He also mentioned the income of the local magicians. Over roast pig and 50-year-old wine at their leader's home, the royal mages discussed the report and ultimately decided to protect the precious collection and observe how their peers there were making money. As they arrived at the castle, Frederick had just given Heinrich a note for 5,000 florins, and the group instantly became uneasy. "Explain it to me," Beecher was the most furious. "Why are you giving Heinrich so many gold coins? If you don't explain, I'll have you taken back to Cologne." Heinrich wasn't well liked within the mages. While capable, he had little influence. Even at roast pig, he couldn't get the best cuts, making him a somewhat invisible figure. Now that he was receiving so much money, everyone wondered if there was some hidden agenda. Frederick smiled. With Psyche by his side, he wasn't afraid of the burning mage's attack. "This money is an investment," Frederick said calmly. "Heinrich will invest 50% in technology, and I'll take 50% with 5,000 florins. The midterm profit is expected to be approximately 30,000 florins." He spoke casually, as if buying a beer at a tavern, oblivious to the envious eyes of the surrounding magicians. How is that possible? Beecher was well aware of Heinrich's strengths and abilities. He excels in electrical magic, and his spellcasting and theoretical knowledge are excellent, but there's no way he's worth that much. Even if you were to capture the king, he wouldn't be worth that much. Heinrich felt a little sad, but he held back his words and continued to sip his tea. Frederick smiled and asked Beecher, "Has Heinrich discovered something? When one lightning magic circle emits lightning, another magic circle can sense it, and its electrical elements will also undergo some changes." Beecher nodded and said, "Yes, there is such magic. We have developed a remote-controlled spellcasting device based on it." He understood the situation. They believed that this magic could fill the gaps in patrols and key protected areas. Once triggered, people nearby would be alerted. Frederick shook his head and said, "It's a waste to only use this method to control the activation of magic traps. You haven't even seen the value in it. When Heinrich mentioned it to me a while ago, I immediately saw the value. Then I gathered everyone together and worked tirelessly to produce the finished product. After 2 days of testing, the results are as expected. Today we signed an agreement to form a partnership. We need to hurry and produce a batch of products. If you don't have anything important to do, you can go around. I'm busy arranging work at the factory." He was about to send them away, but his curiosity had piqued, so they naturally didn't leave. Seeing them like this, Frederick's lips curled slightly. He said to Heinrich, who was sipping tea, "Bring those two devices here, let them have a look." Heinrich put down his teacup and moved the small wooden box at his feet to the coffee table in front of Frederick. Then, carrying the large box, he greeted two familiar colleagues and left the living room. Frederick flipped the toggle switch on the box and sat there quietly with a smile on his face. Beecher and the others took the opportunity to study the magic circle inside the box and were astonished. "How can this be possible?" a magician asked a colleague nearby. The colleague replied thoughtfully, "In theory, it is possible." Beecher remained silent, his thoughts unclear. A minute later, Heinrich's voice emanated from the wooden box on the coffee table. "Do you hear me? I'm counting from 1 to 10. The voice was a bit sharper than normal, but the words were still clearly audible. The two who had left with Heinrich also exchanged a few words. They returned a short time later, asking if anyone had heard what they had just said. Everyone now understood that Heinrich's technology could not only be used to remotely activate the magic circle, but also to transmit sound. The principle of this system was simple and immediately apparent. The sound-transmitting box contained most of a magic amplification circle. This magic circle worked by vibrating air, which drove the wind element flowing through the sound-receiving zone. This vibrating wind element then caused more wind elements to vibrate simultaneously in the amplification zone, which then entered the sound-producing zone. Finally, the air in the sound-producing zone vibrated, producing a powerful sound. There was no amplification zone, So the amplification zone intersected with the electric magic circle, forming an intersection zone. In this intersection zone, the vibrating wind element influenced the electric element, causing the spark to fluctuate as it entered the lightning zone, and the magical signal to fluctuate in strength. The process inside the sound receiving box was reversed. The magic circle receiving the magic signal emitted electric elements that fluctuated in strength and weakness, influencing the wind element in the intersection zone, resulting in a corresponding change in the sound produced. Using these two systems together, sound could be transmitted over great distances. Frederick initially assumed that electromagnetic waves were transmitting information between the two systems. He conducted an electromagnetic induction experiment, but the equipment showed no reaction, suggesting it was something else he hadn't yet discovered. "Can this earn you tens of thousands of florins?" someone asked, puzzled. "I admit this kind of thing is useful in the military, but it's simply not worth that much." Frederick simply smiled and didn't elaborate further on the subject. He now had to send these people away and quickly rebuild the radio station in the castle's highest tower. According to Heinrich's calculations, if he set up a signal transmission magic circle at the castle's highest point, Mixing City, over 100 kilometers away, could receive a clear signal. "I'm not good at magic, and you're not good at making money," Frederick said, shaking his head. "Sir Beecher, I've heard you're skilled in fire magic. Why don't you pursue more research in that area? If you can invent a furnace that uses fire magic and reduce the fuel cost of fire making, the economic benefits will be far greater than a few thousand florins. I'll offer you 50,000 florins to work with you." While Frederick was luring the magicians of the royal mages onto the path of intellectual enrichment, in the blacksmith's shop, Schmidt carefully studied the new documents Frederick's secretary had delivered and began to plan the production of the radio. The core magic circle, the casing, the switches, the volume control, and other components of the radio all needed to be manufactured and assembled. Frederick intended to utilize proven technology wherever possible, which would require coordinating numerous factories to expedite production. Schmidt, familiar with the processes of many of Wessenland's factories and workshops, needed to formulate the plan, which Almaid, in his capacity as industrial officer for the Wessenland government, would then coordinate. When he finished, he found Vanessa still sitting on the sofa in the office. Her eyes were a little dazed, and her hand holding the teacup was shaking a little. "What's wrong?" Schmidt asked her curiously. "You seem afraid of something," Vanessa replied with lingering fear. "It was so scary when Lord Beecher got angry at the master just now. I felt like there were flames all around me and I was about to burn up. It's a good thing I came out at that time, otherwise I would definitely cry." She took a sip of the now cold tea, trying to calm herself down. Schmidt listened for a while to what happened when Beecher and others just went to Frederick's place, frowned slightly, and said, "If it's Mr. Beecher, it makes sense. He and the principal are rivals." "What?" Vanessa was immediately panicked. "Will he do something bad to the master?" Schmidt smiled and comforted her. "Don't worry, it's just an academic disagreement. It won't be resolved by force." Vanessa breathed a sigh of relief, and then asked curiously, "Why do they have a disagreement?" Schmidt looked at the sky outside the window. It was almost lunchtime, so he stood up and said, "Delicious food is a good medicine to calm the mind. I heard that there is a new restaurant nearby. The food there is delicious, and there is also a stone mill in the restaurant that makes music. I wonder if the beautiful lady would be so kind as to have lunch with me. And by the way, let's talk about Mr. Beecher's phlogiston theory, the principal's theory on energy, and the contradiction between the two." Vanessa's face flushed slightly. They'd first met during the smelter's first run of activated carbon production. He'd been staring at her constantly, and she knew exactly what he was thinking. Schmidt was well known among the Wesson leaders, rumored to have a promising future. Vanessa decided to observe him. Before Vanessa could agree, Almight suddenly appeared at the office door and hurriedly said, "Schmidt, have you finalized the plan? If so, call everyone in immediately. We'll discuss it over lunch, and we'll start arranging production this afternoon. The sooner we get it done, the easier it will be for the military." Schmidt sighed, picked up the plan from the desk, and walked over, saying, "Here's the plan." Almight took it and said, "I'll call them. You go to the cafeteria and make arrangements." With that, he hurried off. Seeing Schmidt's somewhat disappointed expression, Vanessa said, "It's okay. We'll talk when you have time." Chapter 134 Magic Radio. April, the clouds vanished without a trace, and the sunny, dry season arrived more than half a month earlier than usual. To the sound of soft music, Bryant, exhausted, dragged himself into his regular tavern. His haggard face, sunken eyes, and dark circles startled the waitress and the patrons near the door. This was his first time drinking there this year, and as soon as he sat down, the man with the goatee at the next table immediately asked, "What's wrong?" "Are you sick?" Bryant said weakly to the waitress. "A strong drink, so I can sleep tonight." Then he replied, "I'm tired. I haven't rested since the Lunar New Year." The man with the goatee asked in surprise, "Why is that? Does the master treat you like the village donkey?" The wine and snacks arrived. Bryant glanced around the tavern, then pointed to the one-minute man's three-piece suit hanging on the wall, a folding rifle, a flying saucer-shaped helmet, and a vest with steel inserts. He then took a long swig of the distilled liquor. "I see," Goatee understood. "Thank you for your hard work. Are you done now?" He then had the waiter bring Bryant a pork knuckle and put it on his account. "Thank you." Bryant put on thin disposable gloves and began to chew on the knuckle. "Of course I'm busy. It's just that the master knows I haven't rested in a while, so he gave me 3 days off. By the way, where can I buy a radio now?" "I'm bringing one home tomorrow." Goatee shook his head and said, "It's right in the square. You can get in line now. There's no curfew there. I sat here a few nights before curfew and then went in with my tent. I was 30th in line." Bryant smirked and said, "No problem. I have a note from the master. No need to queue or pay. Just go and get it. I can save 5 kreuts." Compared to the others, his neighbors were a little jealous and envious of him, as the highest-ranking blacksmith in the territory, and he could see the master. But his words immediately sparked outrage among the other drinkers, who began to complain. Some of them had brought their bedding with them, while others started lining up as soon as the sun rose, waiting until the afternoon. After finishing his elbow, Bryant said to the people around him, "Everyone's done their best. They rented our blacksmith's warehouse to assemble the items. They used to package them beautifully, but now there's no time. They just pack them in plastic bags, tuck in the instructions, and padded them with linen before loading them onto the wagons. Once they're full, they ship them out. There's not enough manpower to assemble them right now. Even university students are skipping classes to help. 4 shifts work non-stop," he added. "The boss is quite capable. He stays up late and gets up late every day, yet he still manages to get in." A new shelf had been nailed to the wall of the tavern, and on it, a square, magical radio the size of a microwave oven was playing. It was music time. The magic radio wasn't expensive. To promote it quickly, Frederick set a price to sell it to locals, allowing for a profit margin of less than 20%. At 5 cruises, it was affordable for many families with a little extra cash, let alone taverns. Frederick was able to sell the radio so cheaply because 2 years of construction and accumulation had provided him with inexpensive materials, sophisticated processing techniques, and a rudimentary industrial system. The main components of the magic radio were an electrical magic circle and a wind magic circle. Magic circuits were first crafted from the cheapest and most readily available magic metals. The electrical magic circle was then encapsulated within an insulated and inexpensive slime board. The sound-generating wind magic circle was attached to a plastic board on one side, while the other side was exposed to the air. The magic metal formula came from Professor Osram's magic lamp factory, who also provided the volume adjuster, a component for a dimmable magic lamp. The metal sheets were directly etched to form the magic circuits, a technique familiar to Springfield Armory, and thus entrusted with a task. The slime glue used for the magic radio's interior and exterior is a mature product, identical to the material used for commercially available hangers. It's manufactured directly at the hanger factory. Thanks to the collaboration of numerous manufacturers within the territory, the combined cost of the various materials used in the magic radio is less than the 2 magic crystals within. These factories are now working around the clock to produce radios for Wesson County. Goatee shook his head and said, "He doesn't have to wait in line. A few days ago, when Bobo was on leave, soldiers could buy 3 radios without waiting in line. He bought one for his family and one for his boss. I heard he went with a girl from a tavern and bought one for her family, too." Bryant, enjoying his snacks, said, "I hear Bobo's on a roll now. Maybe in a few years, we'll all be calling him master." Many of Bobo's neighbors were nearby, asking about his situation, but Bryant simply shook his head, unwilling to discuss military matters. Soon, the radio began to beat 9 times in a row. It was now 9 p.m. After the announcer announced the hour, he reminded listeners that curfew was still an hour away. After a commercial break, the Church of Light would begin its moralizing storytelling session, and after 9:30, evening prayers would begin. The tavern erupted in complaints, but there was nothing they could do. Those who hadn't finished their drinks quickly finished theirs, paid their bills, or left. That same evening, Frederick had moved to the military headquarters building within the barracks, having assigned the Royal Mage Court to research phonographs. He had spent the entire evening in his office, currently tracking the progress of installing high-powered magic radios in villages across the domain. After Heinrich casually shared his findings with him, Frederick had immediately seized on the wireless broadcasting trend and diligently developed a crude broadcasting system and wireless communication equipment. A lord was expected to accompany the army on a campaign, and no matter how talented Frederick might be in the eyes of the world, at his age, rumors would easily circulate on the battlefield. The Wesson family has no other heirs. If the rumor spread that he accidentally fell to his death while riding a horse, the people in the territory would be in chaos. If Frederick was not too young, the people in the territory would have found several groups of fertile women so that he could at least have an illegitimate child. Therefore, it is important to spend money to build a broadcasting system, together with newspapers, to stabilize people's hearts with the official authority during the war, so that all kinds of rumors will not have soil to be born. Today's magic radios are small and are aimed at towns, and villages have large speakers installed. However, this has caused the magic crystal reserves in the territory to drop a lot, and it is not known whether they can be replenished in time. At this time, a staff officer came to report, "Commander, the scouts in the front have sent back news." Chapter 135 The latest enemy situation. A crescent moon adorned the black velvety night sky, along with a cluster of diamond-like stars, casting a faint glow on the ground. Amidst the pitch-black woods, an owl silently flitted, flapping its wings now and then, its large, round eyes searching for mice in the bushes. Suddenly, it spotted a pair of gleaming eyes, larger and rounder than its own, emerging from the nearby bushes, watching every movement below. Count Roth's castle lay in the mountains over 30 kilometers northeast of Wessenberg. The Swabian Rizat River, flowing from Wessenland, flowed through the mountains toward the Rhine, its banks bordered by flat farmland. The castle sat on a small hilltop, surrounded on three sides by water. Many years ago, a moat had been dug on the landward side, and now the castle and the surrounding area were surrounded by water on all sides. A makeshift military camp, built near the riverbank, sat silent, save for the burning of a few braziers for illumination. But 100 meters outside the barracks, the merchant camp accompanying the troops was brightly lit. Barbecue, alcohol, women, and pedophilia intoxicated the souls about to embark on the battlefield. Two dark figures observed everything below the mountain, memorizing it. After a long moment, they slowly retreated, finally disappearing behind the mountain. They were a special forces unit trained by Richard Noel personally at Abeo. Because they chose a black cat as their symbol, they were also known as the Black Cat Squad. Their current mission was to divide into small groups, carrying communications equipment the size of computer cases, to conduct reconnaissance of the surrounding military camps and relay information back to the Military Affairs Department. Half an hour later, inside the map room of the Military Affairs building in the northern camp of Wessenberg, young Franz pointed to the location of Rotberg on the map with a wooden pole and reported the enemy situation to Frederick. Roth has already built its camp and will begin recruiting peasant soldiers tomorrow. They expect to have all 2,000 men in place in 3 days. Roth's city defense troops and other soldiers are currently around 500, and we plan to send 300 more. We currently have 2,000 mountain mercenaries here, who are the core of our force. Roth currently has 9 knights. There's news that 5 of them will accompany Count Roth to Ansbach to rendezvous with His Royal Highness the Crown Prince in Ansbach. They'll be accompanied by 100 cavalrymen, who may take away half the city defense troops and about 500 peasant soldiers. The remainder will be commanded by Count Roth's son. Young Franz couldn't help but laugh at the end of his speech. They were all neighbors, and they all knew everything about Count Roth's family. Frederick also smiled and said, "The horse has worked hard, dragging a pig to the battlefield." The next moment, his expression became serious, and he said seriously, "Although that pig is stupid and surprisingly lazy, he has one advantage. Because he is lazy, he leaves everything to others to do, so he will not delay. If he leaves everything to the mountain mercenaries, we will take it seriously." Little Franz also immediately became serious, and then pointed to a mountain basin more than 40 kilometers southeast of Wessenberg city and continued to report, Count Eichstadt's situation is similar to that of the Roth territory. They are expected to recruit 4,000 peasant soldiers. There are currently 1,000 standing troops and 25 knights, including 7 magicians and 3,000 mountain mercenaries. Reliable news: she will bring all the knights and standing troops to the Ansbach territory, and will also take away some peasant soldiers. Frederick sighed helplessly, and then teased little Franz. It's a good thing you didn't get married that year, otherwise I would beat you up now. Old Franz burst out laughing. The surrounding veteran mercenary officers, already quite interested in the young countess, suddenly lit up at the sight of gossip. During that war, Count Eichstadt had been severely wounded while fleeing from defeat, and died before his return in 1024. His title was inherited by his then 20-year-old daughter. It looked as if all her nutrients had been concentrated on those 2 white slimes, causing her growth from the neck up to be retarded. Not only did she look 10 years old, but her major internal organs also resembled that of a teenager. In reality, Miss Eichstadt was quite resourceful. The fact that Eichstadt's territory was only 20% larger than Wessen's, yet it had more than double the number of knights, was a testament to her ability to manipulate countless men. Count Eichstadt had sought a capable husband for his daughter, and after searching extensively within 100 miles, he found that young Franz was the most suitable, in terms of status, ability, and appearance. He also had the good graces of Count Wessen's influence. The 2 counts agreed that any daughters born to their young men would be given to Frederick as wives. If it was the eldest daughter, the 2 territories would be merged. However, by then, young Franz had already gone out to gain experience, and unexpectedly did not return until 5 years later. Old Franz narrowed his eyes and smiled, saying, "I'm afraid Miss Eichstadt is targeting His Royal Highness the Crown Prince." Frederick sneered and said, "That would be a very interesting scene." Under normal circumstances, he would have gossiped a little, but now that the 2 sides were enemies, it was unclear whether the other side would be left with an intact corpse. The guys at Springfield Arsenal had obtained new ammunition for the old catapults. The interlayer of the double-walled wooden barrels was filled with small pieces of scrap iron, and the inner barrel was filled with a full 20 kilograms of inactivated angina drugs. Little Franz continued to introduce the latest enemy situation, pointing the wooden pole to the Ries territory in the south. At present, Count Ries is still in a decadent state. He has only 5 new knights, 1,000 peasant soldiers, and 3,000 mountain mercenaries. It's just that his temper is hard to understand. I don't know whether he will go to Ansbach territory to join the main force or act independently. Frederick nodded. The Ries territory was the place he had infiltrated the deepest. A lot of children of senior officials were studying at Wiesenberg University and its affiliated schools, so he had no shortage of all kinds of intelligence. Finally, little Franz pointed the wooden pole at the Ansbach county in the northwest, and said solemnly, "This is the enemy's main attack direction. The enemy will use Count Ansbach as the actual commander, and the prince is just pretending. At present, the Ansbach county has merged with the army of the Firth county. There are a total of 40 knights, 30 magicians, 400 cavalry, 3,000 regular troops, 12,000 mountain mercenaries, and the number of peasant soldiers is expected to exceed 6,000. In addition, the prince will bring the royal knights, mainly 50 knights, with about 600 cavalry and 1,000 servant infantry. In theory, the knights will not participate in the battle, but their cavalry and servant infantry should join the battlefield to compete for military merit. These people are all troops from the major families in the royal capital. They are well equipped, and many of the cavalry are knights. Their strength should not be underestimated." After listening, Frederick looked at the sand table and nodded. Judging from the number of people alone, the enemy has a great advantage and it is impossible for them to lose. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 136: Taking the Initiative. The enemy was outnumbered and had a significant advantage, and Frederick couldn't help but feel a little nervous. After all, he had never commanded a real war in his previous life. Watching movies and playing games was one thing, but personally deciding the life and death of thousands of people was another. After calming himself down, Frederick asked, "How does the general staff predict the enemy's actions?" Young Franz had been repeatedly studying the enemy's actions and their own countermeasures with his staff for some time, and now he had a clear idea of what was going on. He used a wooden pole to draw a circle in the north, east, and south of Wesen and said, "Our preliminary assessment is that the enemy will attack from these three directions first, primarily with mountain mercenaries. In order to disperse and mobilize our troops, Landlord Roth's army to the north will attack Lingen, which is only 20 kilometers from Wesenberg. The road is mostly flat, with no strategic locations to defend. This should scare the commander. There's also the possibility of sailing directly to Wesenberg, though that's unlikely. However, disembarking in a deserted area isn't ruled out. Landlord Eichstadt's army to the east is targeting Langner to the south. There are many mountains there, so the march shouldn't be fast. We suspect they'll set out early. Landlord Rees to the south will attack Heim to the southwest. They might simply lay siege, and if necessary, head north to Hausen to outflank the enemy's main force. The enemy's main force will launch a massive attack on Hausen after our forces are dispersed, capturing it in record time. This will open the gates to their territory and allow them to march directly to Wesenberg." Frederick nodded in agreement. Wars are always fought on logistics. The enemy's attack routes are closely linked to roads and water sources, from which the marching routes of large armies can be determined. While this war is geographically limited, and crossing mountains and hills is not a problem, the attackers will need to siege a city, and siege equipment cannot be moved across mountains. Young Franz continued, "The traditional siege tactics of mountain mercenaries are to first attack the villages surrounding the city, driving the peasants into the city to consume its food supply, while looting the locals to replenish their supplies, and then lay siege." Frederick suddenly asked, "And when will the battle begin?" It was old Franz, a veteran of countless battles, who answered. "The declaration of war will be delivered first," he replied. "The time is usually noon, which means a war of honor under the watchful eye of the god of light." Frederick narrowed his eyes slightly and asked, "In other words, the enemy's envoys will arrive early?" "Yes," old Franz replied. "Usually the envoys will arrive a day in advance and make an appointment to meet the next day." Frederick sneered and looked at the sand table quietly for a long time, then asked, "Is it possible to let some of them take action privately before the declaration of war is delivered? It doesn't need to be too early, on the night when the envoy arrives in Wesenberg, preferably in the first half of the night. And even better if it's evening." Everyone in the map room looked at each other, wondering what the commander wanted to do. At this time, a staff officer said, "That's no problem. As long as someone instigates a few words. There will always be brave people willing to do something." Frederick took a wooden pole from the shelf under the sand table and pointed at a village nestled in the mountains on the southern edge of the territory. He said, "It's easy for us to infiltrate Rees' territory. We can send some people here to do something. Once we capture them, we will immediately launch a counterattack. The enemy is too numerous. We can't wait for them to rush over. We must take the initiative and concentrate our forces to defeat them one by one." He then pointed to Rothberg in the north. The wooden pole passed along the river and stopped at Wesenberg. He said, "Roth territory's army has two routes to take, one by water and one by land. There are too many variables. We must deal with them first. This section of river for several kilometers is flanked by swamps, cutting off the land routes along the river. If we can pass through, we can avoid the enemy and reach Rothberg. Then we will prioritize eliminating the enemy. If we act quickly, we can even capture the castle." Fighting a war requires more than just men. Pack horses and vehicles are also needed to transport supplies. Shipping is a good option, but nighttime sailing is rare these days, and a careless ship could easily run aground or hide a reef. While the existing highways are fine, there are many villages and small towns along the way, making the passage of several thousand men and horses easily visible. No one disputed Frederick's plan to launch a proactive offensive immediately. Fighting on multiple fronts is a taboo. It would be best to eliminate the enemy in one direction first. Old Franz frowned and said, "This swamp is very deep near the river, but very shallow on the right bank near the mountain. However, there are too many vampire slimes in it, so I don't recommend going there. When I was young, our two families planned to build a road along the foot of the mountain. Going along the river is much closer than the current road. At that time, the master and we saw a deer chased into the swamp by wolves from the top of the mountain. It fell down before it could even escape an arrow. Within a few breaths, it was covered with red vampire slimes. Those slimes were only the size of a little fingernail at first, but when they were full, they were the size of a fist." Frederick shuddered at this and could only say, "Then we have to give up on that route." Old Franz thought for a moment, pointing to a narrow lake roughly midway between the cities of Wesenberg and Rothberg. There used to be a road through the mountains here, and carriages could pass through it easily, but 30 years ago, an earthquake caused a landslide, blocking a small river. The valley became a lake. It's quite deep, about 100 meters wide. The masters thought about building a stone bridge there, but because of endless arguments about who would pay, it was not built in the end, and we changed to take the current road. We can build a pontoon bridge, fix wooden boards on the empty wine barrels, and connect them together so that the current horse-drawn carriages can pass. After hearing this, Frederick immediately said, "Okay, let's do it. Send someone to walk this road tomorrow, and let the executive yuan organize the preparation of materials for the pontoon bridge." He then pointed to the Eichstatt territory in the east with a wooden pole and asked, "The army here needs to walk a long mountain road after setting off. We can ambush on the way. Can the two main regiments launch another ambush after occupying Rotberg, and can they catch up in time?" After discussing with the staff for a few minutes, Little Franz replied, "If the first battle can be ended before sunrise, the soldiers can arrive at a mountain pass at noon by light carriages. If we can find a way to slow down their marching speed on the road, we can hide calmly." Frederick was still familiar with the road to the Eichstatt territory. He used to visit often and was often held and played with by his older sister. He said, "Then set up some roadblocks to buy them time, try to ambush them, and if that doesn't work, attack their camp at night. Count Eichstadt's castle won't be easy to capture. The mountain on which it sits is even higher and steeper than Frederick's castle, making the climb a long way off and difficult to launch a surprise attack." At this point, a staff officer suggested, "We can use the grindstones at Black's castle to trick the city gates into opening by impersonating mountain mercenaries." Frederick shook his head and said, "It's difficult. Eichstatt is cunning, and I'm afraid they won't let the mercenaries get close." Then, Little Franz thought for a moment and said, "If all else fails, leave it alone. It's not like Rotberg. If we don't capture Nuremberg, the people from Nuremberg will likely take it." Frederick could only nod and then ask, "Next is Wessenland. Is there any way to take them down?" After the first two battles, the enemy should have received the news, and they would inevitably respond. Little Franz replied, "The Wessenland army should be besieging Heim by now. We can cooperate internally and externally." Frederick nodded. Young Franz continued, "The enemy's main force will undoubtedly storm Hausen, and the pressure will be immense. Hausen, flanked by a lake on one side and a mountain on the other, sits squarely on the main northwest route into Wessenland, preventing the enemy's army from taking a detour." Frederick pondered for a long time before finally saying, "Hausen must be defended. I will ask Professor Manuel and his men for assistance." Old Franz said, "I'll go to Hausen." Frederick nodded. Old Franz had fought for the Wesson family for many years and was well known throughout the territory. His presence would help stabilize the people. Frederick then drew a large circle in the southwest of the sand table and said, "After the main force is free, we'll use the road from Ries to Ansbach to get around them, surround them, and destroy them. I have a request. This war will be different from previous ones. We won't just crush them. We'll encircle them. We'll physically destroy the enemy, slaying those inside and intimidating potential enemies. Only then will we be safe." Everyone in the map room felt a tinge of fear. Current wars were primarily based on crushing. Aside from nobles who could be exchanged for ransom, the miscellaneous troops were left alone. Run if you will. This was especially true for the staff officers, who had once been mercenary officers. In the past, when they were defeated, they simply outran the others. At worst, they discard their weapons and armor, or even strip completely naked. The pursuers, seeing no profit, would simply ignore them. Now, this young master wanted to round them up and mow them down like wheat. But this was the only way. The enemy was too numerous. If the fleeing troops were left alone, they could regroup and form a formidable army. Frederick estimated the time and said, "This battle is basically over. Let's go grab a drink and get some sleep. We'll start working on a detailed plan tomorrow morning." Everyone present was stunned. They had assumed Frederick's offensive plan was just one of several, with plans to divide up and defend the city to be discussed later. They hadn't expected the initial version to be the final one. Before anyone could say anything, Frederick yawned and left the map room. Chapter 137, Dividing the Unicorn. With war imminent, the atmosphere throughout Wessenland was gloomy. Just then, Frederick received a shipload of unexpected gifts. "Are you really going to give it to me?" Frederick asked a pagan steward in a linen robe beside him. The steward bowed and replied, "It is absolutely true. Her Highness Sophie is willing to give this winged unicorn and the others to an old friend. Lady Sophie had sent a winged unicorn and a dozen other unicorns, a truly remarkable gift. Frederick frowned. While gifts were commonplace given their pleasant cooperation, and a war unicorn was acceptable, a newly grown winged unicorn was far from normal. It was like a wealthy businessman between two countries. Gifts of luxury cars were commonplace, but a fully fledged fighter jet seemed strange. Go ahead, Frederick said calmly. What are Madame Sophie's demands? He was certain he and Madame Sophie weren't close enough to send her fighter jets, so he asked first. The steward could only say, Your Highness quelled a rebellion at the beginning of the year. If it had been an ordinary family, he could have dealt with them directly, but among them was your mother's family. Your Highness couldn't bear to deal with them, so he wanted to send them to you. Frederick smiled. This was indeed a huge problem. Religious issues these days are no small matter. Many scholars from Constantinople, like Manuel, have different denominations from the local area. Frederick could only let them deal with their own affairs at home and not cause trouble. That's why Archbishop Victor and the others pretended not to notice. Now, if a family of heretics came, even if they kept to themselves, there was no way to prevent radical members of the Church of Light from coming to boost their reputation. They can come here, Frederick thought of an excuse. If they want to live here, they must convert to the Church of Light. With that, he sighed inwardly and said goodbye to this winged unicorn. Faith is a serious matter. Every religion, regardless of religion, has saints who, after being captured by pagans, chose death over conversion. His words were a direct rejection of Madame Sophie. The gift was a good one, but it carried with it a massive time bomb. He couldn't possibly accept the gift and then kill the person. He hadn't anticipated that saints became saints because they could achieve things ordinary people couldn't. No problem, the steward replied immediately. They anticipated this. Whenever Frederick met with pagans, he would always bring along priests from the Church of Light. Today, Bishop Clement of the local diocese was present. Bishop Clement immediately asked, How many are they? The steward replied, 500 in total. Clement's eyes suddenly gleamed, and he pulled Frederick aside to mutter. Convincing pagans to convert was a significant feat. Except for the early days of the church, priests from the Church of Light hadn't converted more than 10 pagans in years. Moreover, this achievement wasn't just for Bishop Clement. Frederick, with his own order of paladins, was considered part of the church system, so he could claim it as well. However, Frederick wasn't interested in the matter right now and didn't have the time to waste on it, so he handed the matter over to the bishop. He approached the steward and said, Okay, when will the men be brought here? The steward replied, They will be delivered with the cotton this year, during the cotton harvest. Frederick breathed a sigh of relief. It wasn't now. Now, it was time to happily divide the unicorn. A crowd had already gathered outside the castle's stables. Unicorns worth 1,000 or 2,000 florins were unheard of by the locals, let alone winged unicorns. Even the members of the royal mages had never seen one. Psyche remained among the unicorns, clutching a small handbag. She constantly rubbed their fur, examined their hooves, pinched their waists, and pried open their mouths to examine their teeth. Only after Frederick agreed to accept them did she approach the steward and ask, These are all fine horns, from the royal stables, right? The steward, sensing her expert inspection and expert wording, replied respectfully, as the master said, These horns have been carefully selected from the palace horn pen. Psyche turned to Frederick and said, These horns are all top quality, perfect for breeding. Anyone offering less than 3,000 florins will be expelled. Frederick's brow furrowed slightly at this. It was too expensive. Psyche, perceiving his thoughts, said, Don't worry, take it. You've never seen one costing over 10,000 florins. Reassured, Frederick went to examine his winged unicorn. This winged unicorn was female. Its wings, located at the junction of its neck and back, stretched over 2 meters on each side. Its body was slightly longer than the ordinary unicorns nearby. Its body was primarily white with hints of golden yellow. A patch of fur above each of its 4 hooves resembled the rising sun. Its mane and swaying tail resembled golden flames. Its horn, translucent and crystal clear, shone with a faint golden luster. Psyche pointed at its horn and said, The better the unicorn, the more magical its horn. The color of the horn changes. A lighter color indicates hunger and lack of strength. A full, energetic horn darkens. Not only Frederick, but the onlookers exclaimed in unison. The territory was full of red-horned mules, which pulled carts, Their horns were the same as those of cattle and sheep, just a different color. So that was the reason. Frederick said with some regret, I wonder how long it will take to learn to ride it. He thought he'd have aerial reconnaissance this time, but he wondered how long it would take to get a license to ride a winged unicorn. Psyche smiled triumphantly and pulled a round, chest-sized piece of transparent crystal from her purse. The crystal floated before her. With a touch of her right hand, 2 magical circles appeared within it, one in the center and one outside, forming a ring. Finally, the crystal split in 2. Psyche placed the ring around the horn of the winged unicorn and handed the inner core to Frederick. At this moment, Beecher, who was watching, asked gravely, controlling chains? Madam, who are you to Master Psyche, the master who invented this magic 200 years ago? Psyche calmly replied, myself. Ignoring the stunned Beecher, she addressed Frederick, have someone make you a necklace to wear so you can control it. Frederick blinked and, like Beecher, asked in astonishment, did you invent the necklace used by the Fire Dragon Knight? Psyche replied proudly, yes, that's impressive. Well, I'll save the compliments for later. First, give it a name and build a bond with it. You'll be able to ride it even without this. Frederick held the crystal and mentally instructed the winged unicorn to lift its left front leg, which the winged unicorn immediately did. He gazed at his new mount, a blaze of golden flame, and said, let's call it Dawn. The winged unicorn nodded, looking pleased. Frederick then walked over to a unicorn, its fur crimson and streaked with golden lightning bolts on its left shoulder. He called Little Franz over and said, it's the strongest, and now it's yours. Little Franz burst into laughter. He'd expected the master to divide the unicorn among the troop, but he'd assumed it would be after the battle, during the rewards. He didn't expect it would happen now. He immediately went over to touch the unicorn's neck, his saliva practically dripping, and he forgot even to say thank you. Taro whispered to the head maid, Carpo, nearby, it looks like he'll sleep with the unicorn instead of you from now on. Carpo snorted coldly and kicked her husband in the calf, bringing him back to his senses and allowing him to thank the master. Amidst the laughter, Frederick called over Jurgen, Lothar, and André. Each of them led a cavalry company. Seeing Little Franz receive a unicorn, they were naturally excited, and now, at the master's call, they rushed over. Frederick pointed to 3 unicorns with dark purple fur and black horns and said, these unicorns are very fast. Each of you gets one. The 3, already prepared, immediately remembered to thank their master. Frederick waved his hand, urging them to hurry and choose. Next came the 2 captains. Heinz received a white unicorn, and Bernd a purple-red one. Guy, the captain of a magician company, received a sky-blue unicorn. The other 5 battalion commanders and the second-generation knights in charge of logistics each received a gray-white unicorn. Everyone happily received their own unicorns. Psyche helped them rub the crystals of their control necklaces on the spot, then told them to go to the meeting room to learn how to raise a unicorn. Then, everyone noticed that there was still a silver-white unicorn in the stable that had not been given away. Everyone looked at Frederick. Frederick smiled and said nothing. This one was naturally for Maria. But now wasn't the time to give the unicorn away. There would be a hunting event in late autumn to celebrate the Archduke Mainz's 80th birthday, and that would be the time to give the unicorn away. Right now, the most important thing was to win the next war and announce the rise of a new power to the world. Chapter 138, Arranging Funeral Affairs. While Wesson and his men were so busy going to the toilet that they wished they could ride unicorns, the military camp outside Ansbach was bustling with activity. In the main tent, Rudolph and a group of counts sat at a round table, guzzling wine and devouring meat, while musicians played cheerful music. The roast pig on the table was mostly gone, and several barrels were empty. The air was thick with the intoxicating aroma of alcohol. Rudolph had just emptied his glass when Count Eichstadt, sitting next to him, quickly refilled his glass. A soft slime accidentally bumped against his arm. Eichstadt suddenly recoiled, her lovely face flushing slightly, and Rudolph's heart skipped a beat. Rudolph leaned in closer and whispered something in her ear. Eichstadt's face lit up with surprise, and she kept asking if what Rudolph had said was true. Rudolph didn't answer, simply continuing to drink. Eichstadt didn't wait for his glass to empty before immediately pouring him a drink from the keg. This time, he didn't shrink back, but his expression was more shy. After a moment, Rudolph smiled and nodded. Count Ansbach, Firth, and Roth all observed the scene but pretended not to notice, chatting about hound training. Their territories connected, and they often hunted together. Count Reese's face was expressionless as he drank and ate alone, not joining in the conversation, nor even glancing at the growing tension between the two. Everyone seemed to be oblivious. They all knew that his only heir was now a fool, his daughter-in-law was barren, and he had tried to make his illegitimate son his legal wife, but his in-laws opposed his plans. He had been drinking constantly for the past 2 years, unable to sober up. Everyone could see that Eichstadt was seducing Rudolf, and the crown prince's reaction didn't seem like a complete novice. As for the outcome, no one expected Eichstadt to become the crown princess. Clinging to someone's influence is one thing, a formal marriage is another. Even if Rudolf was foolish, the king wasn't. But it wasn't in vain. These families were all planted here by the king, their glory dependent on him. Without his support, they would end up like the Wesson family. Just now, under Rudolf's witness, these 5 families signed an alliance agreement to jointly fight against the neighboring duchies of Mainz and Bavaria. If Count Eichstadt could achieve the most in-depth cooperation with the crown prince, it would greatly benefit the alliance and the royal family. Rudolf had something to do later, so everyone quickly ate and drank and dispersed. Count Reese left the tent, where his butler was already waiting. He looked up at the setting sun and said to the butler, "Jules, come for a walk with me." With that, Count Reese, accompanied by his butler, left the barracks and climbed a nearby mountain. The mountain was nearly 100 meters high, and from the summit, one could now overlook the entire military camp. Rudolf could be seen riding his silver-white unicorn, with Eichstadt sitting before him. Together, they left the camp and walked upstream along the nearby stream. Count Reese found a large rock to sit on, motionless as he watched the setting sun. As the sunset began to appear, he calmly said, "Jules, your son and daughter are in Wesson County, aren't they?" Jules stood behind his master for a long time, initially thinking he was just daydreaming. He didn't expect him to suddenly ask the question that could have cost him his life. Fortunately, they had prepared an excuse, and Jules quickly replied, "My lord, I sent them undercover to Wesson territory." Earl Reese remained silent, saying, "They've been with me since they were 10 years old, which is 40 years now. Your family has served my clan since your great-grandfather, nearly 100 years ago." "There's one thing I haven't told you in 40 years. A layer of cold sweat broke out on Jules' forehead, and he had a bad feeling. Earl Reese continued, "The night before you came to me, your father told me that you speak faster than usual when you lie. I didn't expect you to still do that now." A cold sweat suddenly broke out on Jules's back, and his hands trembled slightly. "Well, I don't blame you." Earl Reese sighed deeply. "I am a father too. We understand your thoughts." He patted the stone beside him and said softly, "Let's sit together. It's been many years since we sat together to watch the sunset and talk about our hearts." "When was the last time?" Jules immediately replied, "It was the day before the master's 16th birthday. It turns out to be so long." Earl Reese sighed. 36 years have passed in a blink of an eye. Come and sit down. We haven't talked about our hearts for a long time." After hearing what the master said, Jules sat down next to him carefully. Earl of Reese stretched out his fat palm and patted his shoulder, pinching it hard, then sighed, "You are old too. I remember the last time I patted your shoulder was when your son was born. Your shoulders were very strong then. The child is 20 years old now, and your daughter is 16, and your shoulders are just a bag of bones. Alice, I am sorry for you. When I fell into the ice hole that year, you jumped in to save me. I didn't expect that you would have offspring so late. People of our age, what do we want? We should pave the way for our children before we die. That's what our king thinks. I lost 2 sons and one became stupid because of this. Why was I the first one to jump out and put the blame on Henry? We used to have a good relationship. If she hadn't died young, she would have married Frederick. It was the king who promised that as long as I have a grandson, even if my son is stupid, the family and title will be inherited." At this point, he wiped the tears from the corners of his eyes. He had a daughter who was 3 years older than Frederick. When Frederick was born, the two families planned to arrange a marriage for the daughter, but the little girl died of illness not long after. Jules lowered his head and remained silent, his hands tightly grasping the hem of his clothes. Count Reese continued to sigh and said, "Both of your children are smart. It would be good for them to go to Wesson County. There are many outstanding scholars there. After learning skills, they will have a job anywhere. This battle is not so easy to fight." They all underestimated Wesson County. The high-yield seeds and endless wealth blinded everyone's eyes. "That bastard Ansbach stuffed all the gold inlaid vases brought by the crown prince to me. but kept all the capable servants they brought for themselves. Are these people easy to serve? That bastard Ansbach couldn't serve them, so he stuffed them to me. Maybe I would be killed by these people under the city of Heim. Jules, if some things are to be sold, they must be sold at a good price. People can't think they are very cheap. If I die and Frederick wins, you can open the city gates when they come to attack the city. The conditions are not harsh. Let Frederick treat that silly child well and let him live out his life in peace. Jules suddenly raised his head, turned around and looked at Count Reese in disbelief. In panic, he didn't know what to say. Go back. Count Reese stood up without waiting for Jules to answer. For Count Reese, it didn't matter whether he answered or not. The big tree was about to fall, and it was normal for the monkey on the tree to run away. If Jules had a conscience to take care of his stupid son, then he should thank the god of light. Count Reese saw Rudolph and Eichstadt coming back on the unicorn. Eichstadt held the reins, and Rudolph put his arm around her waist. He sneered and said, I will bring those vases back to the territory the day after tomorrow. You go back tomorrow and prepare a place for them to stay. The battle will be just a few days away. After saying this, he walked down the mountain alone in the afterglow of the sunset. Chapter 139 Ignite the Fuse. Go, go. Count Reese waved his hand, telling the pretty young woman in the gilded breastplate to leave the tent quickly and not delay his drinking. Not long after, 5 young men rode out of Reese's camp and headed north. They were all in high spirits. The helmets and breastplates meticulously crafted by skilled craftsmen and the cloaks embroidered with the gold thread behind them reflected golden light in the late spring sun. Their top-notch war horses, worth hundreds of gold, galloped happily. In the farmlands by the roadside, the women weeding simply glanced up, wiped the sweat from their foreheads, and bent down to continue working. Running in the front was a young female knight who turned back from time to time and shouted to her companions in a clear and melodious voice, Hurry up! Hurry up! Belberk was the granddaughter of the chief minister of the Academy of Heraldry. She was 17 years old and had many suitors in Cologne. This time, King William had each family select a future pillar of state to accompany the crown prince for a gilded journey. She fasted for 3 days during mealtimes before her grandfather agreed to let her go. A restless girl, she had heard a few things after arriving at the Wessenland camp and decided to actually scout Wessenland the day before the battle began. These future pillars of state had been scouting the Ansbachland camp daily, or so the documents recorded. Whether they scoured the city's taverns and restaurants or lurked in the city's brothels for 3 or 5 days was unknown. So, Count Reese assumed she was simply bored with the stinking barracks and looking for an excuse to go for a run, or perhaps, as a girl's preference for cleanliness, she went to the city for a bath. Without a second thought, he agreed. Thus, the valiant knight set out with a small group of suitors, heading for the city of Heim in Wessenland. Near noon, they crossed a boundary marker and arrived in Wessenland. No one noticed a conspicuous tree had fallen on a nearby hilltop. Not far ahead lay a small river, its upper reaches a vast marshland. Belberk paused before a bridge, pointed her whip at it with a gusto, and said, Quick, measure the length and width of the bridge. Immediately behind her, an activist dismounted and began pacing the bridge, meticulously measuring. When the activist finished measuring and approached Belberk to offer his courtesy, Belberk asked, Hey, do you hear the bells? The others listened, and indeed, a faint, rapid, clanging sound of metal could be heard in the distance. Let's go. Belberk ignored her companions who were reporting on the bridge's measurements. Let's go see what's going on. With that, she spurred her horse forward, leaving one person standing there, bewildered. A short distance ahead, the road flanked the village. Outside, a thorn wall, as tall as a man, surrounded the fields. Only a gate remained at the entrance to the main road. Belberk halted her horse by the thorn wall and peered in from her horseback. Be careful, someone rode up to the side. Don't fall. Belberk ignored him, her delicate brow furrowed slightly, wondering why the peasants were so eager to rush to the village. Someone, standing on horseback like her, pondered for a moment and came up with an idea. Let's burn these thorns and force that village to surrender. That'll be our first military achievement. Great, Belberk exclaimed excitedly. She thought of her first military achievement, the prospect of becoming the center of attention in the salon upon her return, with everyone praising and flattering her. The allure was so overwhelming that she didn't consider why Earl Reese hadn't sent out the troops today. Instead, she said, somewhat frustratedly, but we don't have torches. A smug smile crossed the face of the person who suggested it. She was the only fire mage among the five, and the idea of setting fire was naturally a way to show off in front of the goddess she had always pursued. Before Belber could respond, another competitor challenged him. This village is too small. Let's go find a bigger one. Belber thought so too. The village before him was much smaller than his own, so he decided to find a larger one. The man who had originally suggested this was furious. Before leaving, he threw a few ordinary fireballs at the thorn wall to vent his anger. Soon, columns of white smoke shot up into the sky. The group galloped, searching for a larger village. Belberg was unsatisfied with any of these attempts, so he simply burned down the thorn wall to scare the villagers. Not far ahead, Belberg spotted an overturned donkey cart on the mountain road in the distance, with several people beside it. Lihal, dressed like a peasant woman but carrying a bow and arrow, angrily scolded Hazienpraz. You say you're a good driver? Look at you, how can you drive like that? Hazienpraz was frustrated. A merchant from Heim had ordered a cartload of rosin from the village, and he was delivering it today. He'd taken Lihal and a few village girls to the city to do some shopping. Unexpectedly, a nearby village sounded the alarm. Just as he was about to tell Amy's donkey to run faster, he whipped it, and the donkey, in a fit of resentment, steered the cart into a ditch. All right, he said. Unload the goods first, and pull the cart up. Just then, the sound of horse hooves echoed in the distance. 5 knights in brilliant armor stopped on the road. Lihal, Hazienpraz said gravely, take them up the mountain, and I'll hold them back. Wesson County didn't have such wealthy knights. It was obvious they were enemies. At that moment, a village girl anxiously said, you should run too. Lihal calmly told the other girls, come with me now. He can get away on his own. She then said to Hazienpraz, once we're far away, you can run on your own. The world was in turmoil recently, and they'd all been armed for any long journey, just in case. Unexpectedly, they'd need them. Hazienpraz pulled his folding rifle and a short sword from under the donkey cart's seat, loaded the bullets and bayonet. Lihal didn't much like guns, preferring bows and arrows. Meanwhile, Belberg excitedly shouted, quick, take the prisoners. Immediately, a horseman charged forward, drawing his saber and swinging it twice. A layer of flame coated the blade, making him look incredibly heroic. Hazienpraz calmly calculated the horse's speed and distance. Seeing the excitement on the rider's face, he suddenly raised his rifle and fired. The lead bullet penetrated the horse's chest, breaking the arm bone. The horse, losing its support, immediately fell forward. The knight on horseback was thrown unexpectedly, rolling several times on the ground before coming to a stop right in front of Hazienpraz. Hazienpraz unsheathed his bayonet from the man's neck, gushing blood. He didn't even bother to wipe the blood from the blade as he reloaded amidst the screams and roars in the distance. 3 men on horseback charged towards him, and Hazienpraz fired again. This time, the shot missed the horse, striking the leftmost man in the right arm, sending his saber crashing down. The man, clearly unaccustomed to such a severe wound, clutched his bleeding wound and screamed, letting his horse carry him forward. The other 2, focused on Hazienpraz ahead and distracted by the screams, failed to notice the arrows blasting from the nearby forest. Herbs that instantly paralyzed humans and animals were difficult to find, but a prescription for increasing pain was much simpler. The pain inflicted on the warhorse threw the man to the ground. Hazienpraz rushed forward, dodging the frenzied horses. Seizing the opportunity when 2 men fell, he dispatched another. As he prepared to finish off a third, the man grasped the barrel of his rifle, preventing the bayonet from piercing his neck. The opponent, well-fed and well-drinking, was far stronger than Hazienpraz, but the initiative lay in Hazienpraz's hands, and he, undisciplined by martial virtue, relaxed his grip and delivered a powerful kick between the man's legs. From far behind, the sound of a heavy object dropping could be heard. Returning, Lihal fired an arrow, piercing the back of the man's neck, between the gap between helmet and breastplate. Belberg trembled with fear at the sight before him, his mind blank. Only when he saw the man opposite him raise the strange weapon did he think to turn and flee. The sound of gunfire rang out, and Belberg staggered, falling off his horse. There's nothing behind for now. Lihal emerged from the mountains. Hazienpraz hurriedly said to her, why are you back? Run quickly, these are just scouts. We won't be able to escape when the main force comes behind us. Lihar said, don't take the goods anymore, push the car up quickly and report to Heim City immediately. Hazienpraz and others didn't know that when Belberg and others just entered the Wesson territory, The information was passed to Frederick layer by layer starting from the time the first message tree was knocked down on the top of the mountain. Chapter 140 War Broadcast. The sun rose as usual. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the ringing of bells echoed through the room, and Baron Christian awoke from his soft, comfortable bed, beginning a new day. He hadn't slept well the previous night, and the vibrations from the room next door had him thinking it was an earthquake. It wasn't until the shaking lasted for over 2 hours that he realized it wasn't an earthquake, but rather a human-induced tremor. But there was nothing he could do. The top floor of the Sardinian-owned hotel consisted of 2 luxurious suites, and the people living next door must have been wealthy or prominent. As a diplomat to the Crown Prince, Christian understood his current situation and avoided any possible trouble. At 6:30, Christian, with his servants meticulously combing his hair and neatly styling his clothes, wasn't satisfied, so he personally trimmed his mustache with a pair of scissors. At 6:40, he skipped breakfast in his room and headed to the first-floor dining room, where a novel talking machine stood. A note was taped to the machine: "I swear by the God of light that there is no one in the box, Vito. You can trust him with absolute confidence." Last night, Christian arrived at the hotel and heard Archbishop Victor expounding on the Holy Scriptures. He paid a gold coin to the owner and learned that the radio program started at 7 a.m. and ended at 10 p.m. So he waited in the restaurant early, eager to hear what the machine would say. The diplomat planned his schedule. If it was interesting, he'd stay until 11 p.m., then it wouldn't be too late to go to the castle and formally present his declaration of war to Baron Wesson. He was not alone. By 6:45, the restaurant was already packed, and the owner, Vito, had already turned on the radio. Normally, at this time, the radio would have played music, indicating the station was testing the equipment. However, today, as soon as the radio turned on, a shrill male voice boomed, Radio Wesson, everyone, an important announcement will be broadcast at 7:30 a.m. Everyone was stunned. The voice repeated several times before they realized what was happening, and a flurry of discussion ensued. Christian frowned, a sense of unease building within him. He wondered if Baron Wesson was calling on everyone to beat him up. What could a child do when he was angry? But he still finished his breakfast, pea and carrot noodles, at a leisurely pace, and then listened to what the important matter was. It turned out that Christian was right to finish his breakfast before 7:30, and he avoided the tragic end of choking to death. At 7:29, every place with a radio in Wesson territory was filled with people, and the villagers in the village gathered in front of the loudspeaker in the village square. Far away in Lower, Maria was nervously holding her 3 Bichon Frise dogs and waiting quietly with her parents. At 7:30, a burst of impassioned music blared from the radio. 10 seconds later, the announcer's deep voice rang out, "Attention! Attention! This is Wessenberg, and we have important news, brothers and sisters of Wessenland, all those who uphold justice, love peace, and are kind-hearted. Yesterday, April 18, 1026, at 10 a.m., without any announcement or warning, the Allied forces of Ries, Ansbach, Eichstatt, Roth, and Fürth invaded our homeland and burnt villages like Nadius, Barend, Skagas, and Heroes. The people of Wessenland are fighting to defend their homeland against the Allied invasion. Our actions are just. The enemy's conspiracy will be crushed, and victory will be ours." For a moment, the entire Wessenland fell silent. The dark clouds of war had lingered for 2 years, and now, the thunder had finally fallen. Wessenberg was like a tsunami, with angry roars rising from small to large, from far and near. Countless people rushed into the streets and gathered in the city center square, waving their arms and roaring. Administrator Frick appeared in front of the Executive Yuan building above the square and began to announce wartime management measures. His voice also appeared on the radio. Christian sat in his seat for half an hour, the back of his clothes soaked with cold sweat. He couldn't figure it out. They had clearly agreed to meet with Baron Wesson today, send a declaration of war tomorrow, and take action the day after tomorrow. How come the war started yesterday? Then what was the point of him coming here? "Quick," he said to the servant behind him, "prepare the carriage immediately and go to the castle." The carriage was quickly ready, but the intersection below the castle and the bank on the side of the road had been blocked by roadblocks by the city defense forces. Horseback riding and carriages were prohibited, and entry was only allowed on foot. Christian said to the city defense officer, "I'm a messenger. I want to see Baron Wesson." The officer asked, "Do you have an appointment?" Christian replied helplessly, "No." The officer quickly replied, "You can't see the Baron without an appointment." Christian immediately asked, "Where can I make an appointment?" The officer replied, "Appointments are currently suspended." Christian was furious, imagining he was in Cologne, with the Crown Prince's support. He angrily shouted at the officer, "I must see Baron Wesson today. If you can't make the decision, let someone who can speak to me." A nearby soldier said, "This man is so anxious to see the master. Is he an assassin?" The officer immediately stepped back and blew his whistle. Immediately, a large group of people gathered around him. The shield soldier in the front held a heavy tower shield with rows of spikes on the shield surface and a frame on wheels. In a short time, they erected a shield wall, connecting the shields with pins. Spears protruded from the gaps between the tower shields, their tips flashing with electric sparks. Christian and his servants were surrounded, momentarily at a loss as to what to do. Finally, Frick, receiving the news, sent for help, and the two met in front of the main gate of the Council of State. On behalf of Baron Wesson, Frick accepted the declaration of war from Baron Christian. After reading it once, he slammed it to the ground in front of everyone in the square, pointing his finger at the man's nose and angrily swearing, "Shameless! This is the most shameless and despicable act the God of Light has committed since the creation of the world. Even after all this, you still want to deceive us." Although the people in the square didn't know what this man had brought, they cursed him, and the shouting and cursing continued. Knowing he was in the wrong, Christian couldn't defend himself, so he offered a few polite words and quickly left the enraged city. Chapter 141. The first battle begins. Only after the war ended did people learn that the Wesson Army's military counterattack, code-named Operation Steam, officially began at dusk on April 18. The first to engage was the Wesson Air Force. Baron Friedrich von Wesson, commander of the Air Force, pilot, and ground crew, took to the skies aboard as dawn, using the cover of clouds and darkness to conduct strategic reconnaissance of enemy camps. On the ground, hundreds of carriages formed a long line, their headlights converging into a river of light from the air. The road they were traveling tonight had been abandoned for years, having been briefly repaired a few days earlier. In the afternoon, the cavalry advanced and marked the way. Furthermore, the route was mountainous and devoid of nearby settlements, eliminating the risk of enemy detection. By the time Friedrich von Wesson returned from his reconnaissance, the convoy had already reached the pontoon bridge, systematically crossing the roughly 100-meter-wide dammed lake. He chose not to cause any trouble at headquarters, landing directly on a flat surface near the water's edge. Shortly thereafter, a cart pulled by red-horned mules arrived, its driver helping to unload a large wooden barrel and then fetch water. These people are specialized in raising winged unicorns. The leader is Frederick's driver. He got this position by crying and complaining that he had elderly parents and young children at home and that he would be unemployed if his master didn't take the car. The others got it after a good fight. Frederick poured a can of malt sugar into the water, added a little salt, beat a few raw eggs, mixed it evenly, and then called Dawn to come over to replenish his energy. Dawn likes this kind of energy drink very much. He drinks a bucket after flying back, and always leaves a little behind. Then he wants to press Frederick's head with his chin to drink it, because it is specially left for him. Frederick naturally wouldn't drink it, but now he has learned his lesson and immediately took out snacks from the pocket of his leather jacket and started eating. Seeing that he also had something to eat, Dawn no longer asked him to drink. At that moment, little Franz came over, and Frederick asked him, "How's everything going?" Little Franz replied, "Everything is going according to plan. We expect to reach our destination before 1 o'clock tomorrow morning." Frederick nodded. With the war approaching, the mercenaries were becoming increasingly dissolute with the merchants accompanying them, and 1 o'clock in the morning was the perfect time for them to get drunk. At 40 minutes past midnight, the entire army arrived in a valley 3 kilometers outside Rottenburg. All the vehicle lights were covered to block the light from shining into the sky. Everyone disembarked to rest, eat some rations, and drink some water to replenish their energy. At the headquarters, scouts from another hill in the distance, who had been monitoring the enemy, reported the latest situation via communicator. Frederick, little Franz, and a group of officers discussed the details of the next move. The enemy hadn't made any significant changes, and everything was proceeding according to plan. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the entire army set out. The entire cavalry company and the mounted magician company were the first to cross the stone bridge over the moat outside the city. Their goal was to assault Rottenburg. To attack Rottenburg, one must first penetrate Rottenburg Castle, located below the castle, and then ascend the hill to the castle itself. Lord Rothberg had clearly not anticipated an enemy attack at this time, and the presence of the military camp outside the city emboldened the soldiers, leading them to slack off. The gates remained open, and the drawbridge over the moat was only halfway raised. The soldiers on duty at the gates were immediately slashed. A Black Cat squad had entered the city the day before, posing as merchants and escorts. They not only hid in an inn near the gates, but also fetched a good price for their goods. They learned from their communicator that the operation would begin tonight and had been lurking at the gates for over an hour, only beginning their action just now when they heard the sound of horse hoofs. When the cavalry arrived at the gates, the gatehouse had been captured, the drawbridge down, and the gates blocked. Without slowing, the cavalry charged into the city, heading for the castle perched on the distant hilltop. Although no one was available to help open the castle gates, they had brought with them 20 10-kilogram barrels of angina medication, more than enough for a fight. The clatter of horse hooves on the cobblestone pavement echoed far into the night sky. Stealth was no longer necessary. Explosions echoed from the military camp outside the city. Frederick had modified his saddle so it could carry heavy loads 100 kilometers. This time, he carried 2 30-kilogram canisters of angina medication. He slowly flew from 100 meters above the ground toward the largest tent in the camp, aiming and dropping them, then sped away. Although his accuracy was poor, the bombs missed their target by almost 10 meters. The massive explosions wiped out everything on the ground except for 2 large craters. The deafening roar and the shower of falling objects threw the entire camp into chaos. Those still asleep fled their tents, running about like headless flies. Someone knocked over a brazier, causing the tent to burst into flames. The fire quickly spread, filling the air with thick smoke and the stench of burning meat. Eventually, the poison gas bombs funded by the Duchy of Bavaria were ignited. No officers came forward to organize the troops. They all lived in the central tents, most of them blown away by the explosion. A few were still outside the camp, having spent time with merchants accompanying the troops. Count Roth's son lived in a large tent, and Frederick eventually gave him a cenotaph, citing the time he had once taken Frederick to watch a maid bathe. Another explosion ripped through the wooden walls of the camp. Bernd, commanding the Golden Angels Regiment, opened the wall with their cherry cannons, then began firing forward to establish a blockade and cover the P Company's advance. Frederick, a man with a latent naming problem, was at a loss for a name or emblem for the unit, so he left it to them to decide. Meanwhile, Bernd's regiment, carrying a banner embroidered with a golden angel, charged into the camp, forming a horizontal formation and sweeping across the area. Anyone who moved in front was killed, and anyone who gathered was targeted with the cherry cannons. After the battle, a survivor of the mountain mercenaries described what he witnessed that night. The entire camp was filled with choking smoke. Suddenly, a line of dark figures emerged from the firelight, moving through the fumes like demons crawling out of hell. Each was dressed in dark gray, from helmet to clothing, with a golden angel on the front. Their faces were adorned with large, round eyes that reflected the terrifying firelight, and their noses were thick, long, and held in a pouch at their waists. Their steps were swift and determined, ruthlessly slaughtering anything that moved, leaving only death in their wake. Elsewhere, Heinz's regiment, flying the snow leopard banner, began its march into the city below Rothberg. Led by the Black Cat squad, company after company descended on the homes of higher-ranking officials, seizing the city gates, the port, city government offices, granaries, and warehouses storing vital supplies. The war came so suddenly that no one had time to organize a resistance. A fierce resistance took place at the castle gates. A company of magicians, their left armbands embroidered with a flaming ram, withstood the pressure of the archers atop the walls and quickly breached the gates. 3 cavalry companies immediately charged into the castle, 1 clearing the perimeter while 2 attacked the main building. The Roth and Wesson families had long ties, and their knights often exchanged views. An old knight guarding the castle entrance saw the group charging in aggressively. Recognizing their leader, he shouted, "Jurgen, let us speak." In the name of knighthood, Jurgen waved his hand to silence the attack and surrounded the old knight and several of his followers. One young follower was so frightened that he dropped his weapon. He trusted the old knight before him, whose status in the Roth domain was comparable to that of old Franz. "Senior Royce," Jurgen said, "surrender." Royce's voice was as loud as ever, without a trace of fear or humility. He gripped the longsword tightly in his hand, just like he usually spoke. "For the sake of my wife and my daughter, I can surrender." But I have a conditions. Who is leading the army today, old Franz? Let me talk to him. Soon after, he shouted in surprise, "It's you." Frederick tucked his brand new flight helmet with goggles under his armpit and said directly, "MRS. Roth and Miss Roth can take half of their dowry back to their parents' home. I can send someone to escort them." Royce naturally wanted to seek benefits for his wife and Miss, so he said, "All of it. Later, my wife can say something good for you." Frederick understood that he meant about his defeat in a while. He snorted coldly and said unconvincedly, "I can defeat you in one night. Do you think that old guy Ansbach dares to act rashly? My father is a saint. Do you think the Pope will easily watch me being bullied? Believe it or not, the next step is for the church to step in and offer everyone a way out. As for Count Roth, haha, if the king admits his mistake, I'll return half of his land to him. It's no problem for him to redeem all of it. Otherwise, go to Cologne and become a court noble. The problem is, if the king can abandon the Wessens, why can't he abandon the Roths?" His words rang true, especially since the king's targeting of the Wessens had left a thorn in the side of the other families. Royce fell silent. He had seen a lot, and this kind of tactic of using force to force negotiations was not without precedent. What Frederick described was very likely to happen. For another thing, the lightning-fast sieges and castle stormings in the middle of the night were enough to make the other families nervous and force them to agree to peace talks. If that were the case, a world would be achieved where only the Roths would suffer. Royce could only say, "Okay, I'll go ask my wife." Frederick's mouth curled up slightly, and he said curtly, "MRS. Roth is very kind to me. The last time I came to visit her, she even baked apple pie for me. I'll send Jürgen to take her back to Eichstatt Castle the day after tomorrow." Chapter 142 Change of Plan. In this era, a city was the political and economic center of a region. Control of a city meant control of the region's economic lifeline, akin to capturing a point and lighting up the map. As the people of Wesson County gathered around the radio, awaiting the announcement, 200 defenders from Wiesenberg and Lingen arrived in carriages at Rothberg to take over the city's defenses. In the city's central square, the former defenders lined up to receive their severance pay and, witnessed by the local bishop of the Church of Light, swore to the God of Light that they would never again be enemies of Baron Wesson. Frederick made no effort to embarrass the captives. The defenders received a full year's wages in advance, with those interested immediately offered new jobs. The conscripted peasants were given a bunch of sausages, and those who died received a pension of 1 gold coin each, made up of captured rations and funds from the castle treasury. Roth County needed to absorb the troops, and he didn't want to incur public outrage or have a Linden pop up every other day. The captured officials would not be treated so favorably. They would have to pay a ransom for their freedom. Having lived together for so many years, they knew who had wealth and what assets. Someone complained to Frederick about their poverty, so he tied a rope around his waist and another to his saddle. Less than 3 meters from the ground, not only their own private funds but also the money others had left at their lovers' homes came spilling out. Frederick told them, "You are talented people for governing the area. I'm short on people, but if you perform well, you could be reinstated. First, stabilize the city." The planned acquisition of 6 times the size of his original territory in a short period of time would inevitably lead to a shortage of administrative staff, so he planned to relocate them. In the military camp outside the city, only 700 or 800 of the 2,000 mountain mercenaries were captured. Frederick was planning to build a railway network centered around Wiesenberg and the future Oak City on the canal. Even if trains weren't readily available, a horse-drawn railway would be a valuable addition. These captured mercenaries were prime labor, and the dismissed city defenders could be used as overseers. Many were already doing odd jobs, watching the captives clean up the battlefield. Frederick hadn't anticipated the complexities of managing a captured city. This morning, while the officers and soldiers, fresh from the previous night's battle, were catching up on sleep, he was clad in a small silver-scale breastplate, with a sort of hermit, a gift from Psyche, and the paladin saber issued by the Church of Light slung around his waist, acting a bit like a bully. At noon, Frederick, Franz Jr., and the others waited for their sauerkraut stewed with meat and noodles to finish cooking. A news broadcast played on the radio nearby. It reported on Baron Christian's declaration of war and its contents, followed by Frick's speech refuting the enemy's shamelessness. Frederick said, "Ansbach should have received the news by now, and may start to act tomorrow." Little Franz said with some concern, "I'm worried that Count Roth will ask Count Ansbach to attack here first, Frederick shook his head and said, Ansbach dare not. He is worried that the time it takes to go back and forth will be enough for us to take down his nest. Even if he comes, we will empty the warehouse and retreat, and then it will be the Eichstadt territory and the Reese territory. Let's see what he will do. There are a lot of gold coins in the castle, as well as gold, silver and jewelry. These alone are enough to make money, not to mention that the castle's defensive magic circle has not been activated in time, and those high-quality magic crystals can be moved back. Frederick continued, the army will set out once they've eaten. I'll go back and ask Bishop Clement to send some priests to the garrison. The Golden Angels will serve as a reserve for the next battle. Jurgen, escort Mrs. Roth to the Eichstadt family castle. Once inside, attack immediately. They had somewhat overestimated the soldiers' mental strength. After the battle, the soldiers who attacked the barracks regained their composure, and the sight of corpses and the stench of blood in the air left many feeling emotionally unstable. Therefore, the early morning transfer plan changed to resting here until noon, then seeking counseling from the priests. The veteran mercenaries in the army were helpless. They simply fought on, returning home to farm when they couldn't. Frederick himself was no better, simply holding on. Intermarriages had existed between the surrounding fiefdoms for generations. Mrs. Roth was the aunt of the current Count of Eichstadt, and her mother was the sister of Frederick's grandfather. They were all relatives. So after Mrs. Roth surrendered, Frederick decided to send her back to her parents' home and take the opportunity of entering the castle to occupy Eichstadt Castle. After they finished lunch, Royce came to find Frederick and said that Mrs. Roth wanted to leave now and wanted to see Frederick. Frederick met Mrs. Roth in the castle. The lady who was as round as dough a few years ago was still full of energy now, not like someone who had just lost her son. She was holding her daughter who was less than 3 years old in her arms. In the face of major issues, relatives are not mentioned, but now that the fight is over, they can be discussed. Frederick thought she was going to curse him, asking why he killed her son, and was thinking about how to say comforting words. Unexpectedly, Mrs. Roth got straight to the point. I'll take all my dowry, and I'll help you capture the Eichstadt castle. Send your men with me, and once we're inside, have them attack. Frederick blinked and said calmly, I can't imagine why you do that, and I killed your son not long ago. In his memory, Mrs. Roth had always been an ordinary noblewoman, hosting tea parties and managing the internal affairs of the territory, not some ruthless character. Mrs. Roth smiled bitterly and shook her head, whispering, you don't understand the affairs of our generation, and I don't want to talk about them. When you get back, you can ask old Franz and the others. They'll understand once they tell you. As for the one you killed, he was Count Roth's son, not mine. Frederick frowned and said, I need to confirm this first. I'll come back later, Mrs. Roth replied calmly. Okay. Frederick left immediately and contacted old Franz and Alfred in Hausen via the communicator. Then he got a big surprise. Simply put, when Frau Roth was still Miss Eichstadt, she and the current Count Ansbach were in love. However, for their own selfish interests, the old counts of the Eichstadt and Ansbach families forced them apart. Miss Eichstadt became Frau Roth, and then Mr. Ansbach chose a daughter of the Firth family who was as plump as Miss Eichstadt as his match. This was a tragedy brought on by feudal arranged marriages, but the story wasn't over yet. The two subsequently met privately year after year, with the help of others. Frederick frowned when he heard the location, the lakeside villa of the Wesson family, now the site of the University of Wessenberg. But that wasn't the main point. The key point was that the little girl Frau Roth had just held was Count Ansbach's, and the meeting took place shortly before the expedition, as news had already reached them. Old Franz was certain of this, as he had been keeping watch at the villa at the time, and the timing matched. Frederick understood that Madame Roth was seeking revenge against the Eichstadt family. He returned to the castle and told Madame Roth straight out, I can't guarantee Count Ansbach's safety on the battlefield. Madame Roth nodded silently and said, I understand, but if you capture him, I can pay the ransom. Frederick immediately agreed, adding, if you want to invest in some business in the future, you can come to me. I can't guarantee how much money you can make, but it should be enough to save a decent dowry for your young lady. Madame Roth immediately said, thank you for your generosity. If that man dies, please inform me immediately so that I can resume my old name. Frederick also agreed. Let's set off soon, he added. We'll arrive at Eichstadt Castle by dark. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 143 Delivering Letters. April 19th, the old knight of the Roth family, Royce, arrived at Lord Ansbach's camp and informed Count Roth of the castle's fall, his son's death, and Frederick's remarks in the early morning. Count Roth was silent for a long time, then said to the old knight, "You and I will go to the Crown Prince and Lord Ansbach later. Don't tell them that the lady and daughter have been sent away. Instead, tell them that they are being held captive by Wesson and are demanding a ransom of 2,000 florins." Royce was silent for a moment, then agreed. Rudolph then saw Count Ansbach leap from his chair and shout, 2,000 florins. Why isn't he just robbing them? The Crown Prince didn't understand why he was so concerned. Counts Firth and Eichstadt, who were standing nearby, were fully aware of the situation, but now was not the time for gossip. Count Ansbach was surprised, but he quickly calmed down. Instead of discussing ransom or retaking the castle, as Count Roth had intended, he turned to Rudolph and said, "Your Highness, I suggest that the Eichstadt army and Count Rees set out tomorrow, and we attack Hausen the day after tomorrow." Rudolph asked, "Why don't we help Count Roth reclaim the castle first?" Count Ansbach replied, "Wesson captured the castle in a single night, meaning he took a large force with him. There must be very few people in Hausen and other cities right now." Rudolph thought his point made sense. Furthermore, the old knight had also stated that the main force of Wesson outside the castle was roughly the same as the intelligence had indicated. The cavalry and magician companies were all there, and the defenders of Weissenberg and Lingen had also entered. This meant that the other cities had no main force left, only a few improvised militias. Furthermore, the Wesson army had just fought a major battle and needed a day's rest there. If they marched on Rothburg tomorrow, they would be well rested, and Rudolph was exhausted from arriving. Rudolph agreed to Count Ansbach's battle plan and immediately dispatched messengers. Those present were naturally unaware that Frederick had deliberately let Royce see all this, and his words in the early morning had convinced them that he was truly using force-to-force negotiations. No one could have anticipated that the Wessenland army was equipped with a large number of wagons for transportation. The territory had already been mobilized, and the ample logistical support enabled the troops to conduct high-intensity, continuous combat. As soon as the morning broadcast concluded, peasant women from dozens of villages south of the city of Langenor in southern Wessenland, led by their respective leaders, began bustling about in the drying yards outside their villages. Some were setting up stoves, fetching water, kneading dough, washing vegetables and chopping meat, and still others were preparing horse feed. The ingredients had been delivered the previous night, and every village was required to prepare steamed bread with meat and vegetable soup by noon. Thomas's village, Redmud Pine Tree Village, was also assigned a task. The drying yard wasn't large, but the area next to the lumber mill was ample for storing materials, and there was a direct road leading there, making it very convenient for cooking and arranging meals. Hausen Plaz, Thomas said to someone who was lighting a fire. "Once the fire's done, wait at the intersection. Don't let them get lost." "Why should I go?" Hausen Plaz said, a little annoyed. Thomas didn't care whether he liked it or not, and smiled. "You're a hero now. Maybe the principal will give you a medal and have your picture in the newspaper." Hausen Plaz's face darkened. That would be terrible. What if his past as a thief was dug up? "Let Liho go," he said. "She put in a lot of effort yesterday," but Thomas said, No, our village would be in vain if someone married off a girl as talented as Liho. We need to keep her here. Don't resort to violence." Liho, who was chopping meat, immediately pursued the village chief with a knife, filling the surrounding area with laughter. Just as Thomas was about to be turned into steamed bun filling, a messenger arrived on horseback. Thomas was surprised at first, then relieved, when he heard the news. He went back and told everyone, "Don't rush. They need to get some sleep and won't be back until dusk." Then he said seriously to Hagenpraz, "You should go and meet them. Lead the way as they leave. You know, our area is full of mountains and narrow paths, and it's easy to get lost." Hagenpraz reluctantly agreed. He often traveled to surrounding villages for small business, and he would sometimes get lost at first, once even ending up in Riesling, further south. Around 3 in the afternoon, a man and a horseman arrived outside the village along a mountain path. Seeing the aroma of food wafting from the lumber mill, they hurried over. "Give me something to eat," he said, dismounting from his horse and sitting down at a long table in the clearing. throwing a few copper coins onto the table. Then he asked, "Are you celebrating a festival here today?" Thomas was about to go over when both Hazenpraz and Lihal simultaneously stopped him, signaling the other village girls to stay put. Lihal took 2 buns from the steamer and sat down beside the man, saying delicately, "Sir, you've come at the perfect time. Our village is celebrating the start of the pine resin harvest today, and dinner won't be served until dusk." Thomas and the surrounding village girls were stunned. They had never heard her speak like that before. The man picked up the bun and compared it, then asked, "Where are you from?" "How do I get to Eichstatt?" Lihal quickly replied, "We're in Master Reese's territory. You need to go further east, elsewhere." Thomas followed Hazenpraz to his house and saw him take a clay pot from a box. Curious, Thomas asked, "What are you doing?" Hazenpraz replied, "That man is a soldier. He has a mailbox in his horse's bag, so he must be delivering mail, but not from our side. He seems to have lost his way in the mountains." He pulled out a smaller pottery bottle. Thomas gasped and said, "We need to catch him." Hazenpraz walked out with a bottle, saying, "I thought so too." Returning to the lumberyard, Hazenpraz poured some powder into his hand, clenched his fist, and brought over a bowl of vegetable soup. The messenger was flirting with Lihal, oblivious to the food being brought over. Just as he was breathing normally, exhaling and about to inhale, Hazenpraz loosened his fist slightly and blew a puff of powder into his face. The man was startled at first, but he still managed to inhale a significant amount of the powder, his vision blurring. Thomas saw Hazenpraz gesture to him and immediately went to the newly built village office and turned on the communicator. Over an hour later, dawn broke, and Frederick, having received numerous notifications, arrived first. The messenger was snoring over the table, reeking of alcohol. "What's going on?" he asked Thomas as he delivered the safety harness. "Are you sure it's a messenger?" Thomas and the others were seeing a winged unicorn for the first time. Only after Frederick jumped down did they regain their composure and reply, "It's a message from the Ansbach camp to the mountain mercenaries in Eichstatt, instructing them to dispatch according to the time written in the mailbox." "He doesn't know the exact time," Frederick asked. "Is the message true?" Thomas pointed at Hazenpraz and said, "He drugged someone, and he answered whatever I asked. I've asked, and he's a messenger for Count Ansbach." Hazenpraz and Lihal had already opened the mailbox and removed the letter. Frederick read it and curled his lips. The letter was made of paper produced in his own territory. The letter stated that Rothland had been captured and instructed them to set out early tomorrow morning to attack the city of Langner. Frederick thought for a moment, then turned to Thomas and asked, "I remember you studied painting. Can you forge a letter?" Thomas immediately replied, "No problem. I also have this kind of paper. I can forge one." Frederick nodded and said, "Then write one right away. Don't change anything. Just ask them to set out overnight and surround the city of Langner early tomorrow morning." Thomas immediately went back to get paper and pen. After practicing several times, he wrote a letter according to Frederick's wishes. At the end, he traced the signature and signed the names of Rudolf and Count Ansbach. He then used a hot iron to remove the wax seal and stick it back on. After putting it back into the chimney, he used the same method to restore the wax seal to prevent it from being opened. Not long after Frederick left, Lihal slapped the messenger awake. "Master, wake up." The messenger jumped up, surprised, and said, "How did I fall asleep just now?" Lihal pointed to the empty bottle on the table and replied, "Well, didn't you say you wanted to have some wine and then take a nap?" The messenger scratched his head, unable to remember clearly, but it seemed that this was indeed the case. He looked up and saw that it was getting late. He quickly mounted his horse and headed east towards the Eichstatt territory. Chapter 144 Another Victory. The late spring nights were far from silent. Countless insects sang joyfully in the bushes and by the streams, sometimes claiming territory or seeking mates. However, their songs could sometimes bring disaster, and the sounds would often cease abruptly. The carriage slowly moved along the dark mountain road. Mrs. Roth opened the window and chatted occasionally with Jurgen, who rode beside her. "It's been years since I've heard the insects chirping in the mountains of my hometown," Mrs. Roth sighed. Jurgen breathed a sigh of relief. She had finally stopped asking herself questions like whether she had been knighted, how much she earned annually, whether she had bought a house in Weissenberg, whether she had found a girlfriend, and how much grass her unicorn consumed per 100 kilometers. But the young man was too happy too soon. After recalling the night in her hometown, Mrs. Roth continued to ask Jurgen, "What kind of girls do you like? Tall or short? Mature and steady or cute and lively?" Good at housework or good at dancing with guns and sticks? Big breasts or round buttocks? There are many young ladies of the right age for you in Roth County. Do you want me to organize a garden party for you to meet them? Tell me which one you like. If you feel embarrassed to come alone, you can ask Lothar, Andre and others. They don't have girlfriends either. Jurgen's face suddenly became darker than the night, so he decided to divert the trouble and said, Madam is so well informed, why don't you introduce a few to our master? Mrs. Roth smiled and said, who doesn't know what Frederick is thinking now? He has good eyes. Miss Eltel is not only beautiful, but also has a copper mine at home. I don't know how many people in the Duchy of Mines are secretly angry. You should think more about yourself. I tell you, the daughter of the judge of Roth County. Jurgen sighed helplessly, dismissing her words as the chirping of insects nearby. Finally, the Eichstadt family's castle appeared before everyone. Roth sighed, then said to Jurgen, Rasinger is still the steward of the family. He's old, so I'll try to keep him in check. For my sake, don't hurt him as long as he doesn't go too far, Jurgen replied expressionlessly, as long as he doesn't get in our way. The convoy made no secret of its whereabouts and swaggered to the castle under the Roth family's banner. The mountain surrounding the basin where the castle was located resembled a mountain. The castle was located at the top of a small mountain range protruding from the center, with only one road in and out. Instead of going around the basin and up the mountain from the main road as usual, the convoy took the mountain road over the mountain, which instantly made the defenders of the castle nervous. Mrs. Roth, carrying her daughter, arrived at the gate in front of the castle's main entrance and shouted with full energy, I'm back. An old sergeant at the gate asked, Is that the young lady? It's me. Mrs. Roth recognized the man. Oh, you're still in the army? Didn't you go home to butcher pigs? It's really the young lady, the old sergeant shouted happily. The young lady is back. Open the gate quickly and tell the old housekeeper. Jurgen monitored the movement at the gate while observing the military camp in the distance, down the hill. The camp, numbering between 3,000 and 4,000 men, was now dark and deserted. The gate opened, and the convoy, the cavalry company, and the mage company passed through the heavy gate without incident. A little over 100 meters ahead lay the castle, flanked by hillsides over 100 meters high. The castle gate opened, and an elderly man in his twilight years walked out hurriedly with a hunched back and a cane. When he saw Mrs. Roth, he said happily, The young lady is back, and the little lady is back too. It's good that you're back. Why didn't you tell me in advance how many days you would be staying? Mrs. Roth held her daughter in one hand. The little girl looked at the old man in front of her curiously. With the other hand, she supported the old housekeeper and said, I'm back and I'm not leaving. Oh, Rasinger asked in surprise, did the young lady have a fight with Count Roth? Then he immediately said, Oh, it's not good to talk about this here. The young lady, go in and rest first, Mrs. Roth asked in confusion. Don't you know what happened in Roth County? Rasinger answered blankly, I don't know. What happened, huh? He saw the people behind Mrs. Roth. Aren't you guys the little guys from the Wesson family? Why did you escort the young lady back? Mrs. Roth immediately said, Well, you know there are those rude mountain people everywhere now. How dare I walk at night without them protecting me? Yes, Rasinger nodded repeatedly. Those people are so hateful, making trouble in the city every day. They made more trouble after the eldest lady left. We didn't dare to go down the mountain, for fear that they would get drunk and fight, but now it's good. They started packing up in the evening and left not long after. Mrs. Roth looked relieved and said, That's good. Let's go in first. You ask all the officials in the city to come to see me. I have something to say, and them, arrange for them to have a good rest. There was a military camp next to the main building of the castle. Mrs. Roth and Jurgen went into the castle first, and Rasinger went to arrange for others to rest in the military camp. In the living room, Frau Roth and Jurgen discussed their next move. Soon after, Rasinger arrived, bearing tea and milk. He said, the Wesson lads are truly remarkable. They're guarding the young lady's carriage without even taking a break. I'll have the things brought in shortly. Frau Roth asked the old housekeeper to sit on a nearby sofa, and the two began chatting until the officials from each state arrived. Unaware of the capture of Rothberg, they assumed Frau Roth had gone back to her parents' home to relax. As everyone arrived, Frau Roth's teacup suddenly dropped to the ground with a resounding clang, the delicate glass instantly shattering. As everyone was stunned, the living room door suddenly flung open, and a group of Wesson cavalrymen rushed in. each holding a gleaming saber, surrounding everyone present. "Everyone," Mrs. Roth said coldly while holding her daughter, "I have cooperated with Baron Wesson. Now that Baron Wesson has occupied the Eichstatt territory, who objects?" Immediately, someone stood up from the sofa and said angrily, "I object." Before he could finish his words, a flash of golden light appeared, and the man's head fell to the ground. The body shook and fell onto the sofa. Jurgen continued to stand behind Mrs. Roth with an expressionless face, as if the incident had nothing to do with him. Everyone in the living room looked at the head lying on the ground with its eyes open. The smell of blood rushed into their noses, and for a moment they did not dare to act rashly. Mrs. Roth said calmly, "Objection is invalid." At this time, Leisinger stood up trembling, opened his mouth several times, and finally asked, "Why?" "Because my niece is too stupid," Mrs. Roth said angrily. "Look at the stupid things she did. She is sending the Eichstatt family to hell. This idiot actually wants to be an enemy of Wesson. Is Wesson easy to mess with? Look around you, they are all good players trained by the sword St. Richardnal. How many lives do you have to fight them? Have you forgotten that Wesson owns Wessenberg University? How many magicians are there? There are more than 100 people who followed me today. How many lives do you have to fight them? I tell you, in half an hour, they broke down the city gate and the Rottberg gate in half an hour, and 20 minutes of them were spent on the road. How many lives do you have to fight them? Those rude mercenaries outside the city were killed by them in a short while. How many lives do you have to fight them? If Baron Wesson hadn't remembered the old friendship, I would have been dragged away and beheaded long ago." Baron Wesson said that if you surrender and pay a symbolic ransom, not only will you be free, but if you behave yourself, you can even be reinstated. You can't be here, but you can serve as an official in Roth territory or elsewhere. Those who are capable can even go to Wesson territory. If you don't want to be an official, you can invest in some property if you have money. If the entire territory performs well, in 2 years, renting a 99-year-old farm and growing high-yield wheat, pumpkins, chickens, and slimes won't be a problem. After Mrs. Roth finished speaking, silence fell in the living room. Everyone looked at each other. No one dared to be the first to speak out. They could speak in favor. What if Count Wesson lost the war? They couldn't oppose it. The tax collector wasn't dead yet. Everyone was stalling, as if that would solve the problem. Mrs. Roth handed her daughter to Reisinger to take her to rest, and Jurgen sent someone to protect her. She and the others fought on, waiting to see who could outlast them. At dawn, someone entered. Frederick threw a pile of rags on the ground and said expressionlessly, "I'll give you 5 minutes to make a decision." The Eichstatt officials present recognized the rags as the mercenary banners seen in the barracks a while ago. It was clear that these men had been killed by Baron Wesson. Many stole a glance at the now dead tax collector before making their choice. At dawn, the mountain mercenaries and peasant soldiers returned to the camp, now captives, all covered in dust and dirt. They were guarded by the former Eichstatt defenders, and their fate was to be used in the construction of the railway. Near noon, the defenders from Langenor city began to take over the defense. The Snow Leopard Regiment, which had led the battle the previous night, held a ceremony to enter the city. Under Baron's command, the Snow Leopards were ambushed on both sides of a bend in the mountain road. The long line was invisible to those in front and behind. Explosions, screams, and wails were heard everywhere, and morale quickly collapsed. When the Snow Leopards launched a bayonet charge, most of the enemy surrendered. Of the last 3,000 mountain mercenaries, only half remained. And the peasant soldiers who had been transporting the siege equipment suffered few casualties. Frederick instructed Madame Roth to organize the citizens to clean up the battlefield. He also allowed the 2 regiments to rest outside for a day, with the priests providing psychological counseling to the soldiers, before heading to Heim. Chapter 145 On the March. Heim city lies southwest of Wessenland, leading south to Lisland. Surrounding it are several hills, numerous rivers and streams, and small swamps. This newly upgraded town is modest, with a permanent population of approximately 3,000 and walls only 6 meters high. On the morning of April 20th, Count Lis led an army of 3,000 mountain mercenaries, 1,000 peasant soldiers, 5 knights, and 45 gilded knights into Wessenland, marching directly upon Heim city. Following their usual tactics, the mountain mercenaries dispatched 100 mounted infantrymen on ordinary horses, divided into groups of 10, into Wessenland at dawn to attack villages and drive the inhabitants into the city. Unlike the day before, several large trees were haphazardly placed on the road today, their stumps still blocking the path. Nearby, in the grass, slimes, sated with sawdust, were digesting their food. The group paused along the road, and some dismounted to remove the trees. Buzz, 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 a swarm of wasps suddenly flew out from the treetops. Each was the size of a thumb, its body a black crystal, gleaming menacingly in the sunlight. Helvete curses. It's the Black Forest wasps, run. It's the Black Forest monkeys, ah! The mountain mercenaries immediately saw through their old enemy's trick and turned their horses to flee. The men who had come down to move the trees, seeing they couldn't escape, resorted to lying flat on their backs, burying their faces in the dirt to avoid exposing their skin. The horses couldn't cover themselves completely, so the enraged Black Forest wasps stung them fiercely. The stung areas instantly turned black and swollen, and the intense pain drove the horses mad. Some of those running behind were stung so hard that their horses threw them to the ground, attracting the Black Forest wasps to their faces. The faces or necks of those stung quickly swelled, squeezing their trachea and ultimately suffocating them to death. The mountain mercenaries ran over 2 kilometers before daring to stop. They gathered various items to cover their heads and faces, lit torches, and headed back to claim their place. When they returned, they found the men sprawled on the ground dead. This had cost them 15 men, more than Wessen's army had lost so far. Torches were thrown into the treetops, and the flames quickly consumed the beehives hidden within. Just then, several fist-sized objects landed among the crowd, sending shockwaves and substandard-bearing steel balls careening in all directions. The Heim City Fire Department was also equipped with cherry cannons, but today they had swapped their firefighting melon shells for fragmentation grenades. Bullets rained down, and at a distance of less than 30 meters, the mercenaries' leather and mail armor offered little defense. After several rounds of gunfire, there was no one left standing on the road. A group of grass-covered figures suddenly emerged from the bushes on either side of the mountain forest. They ran off into the distance, soon vanishing without a trace. In charge of the defense of Heim was Otto, commander of the Whetstone unit. Well versed in the tactics of mountain mercenaries and familiar with the weaponry and tactics of the new Wessenland army, the Whetstones, trained in their new weaponry, dispatched them, along with the eager firefighters, to harass the enemy. This unit consisted of veterans, each brimming with scheming and intrigue. The vanguard of the Wessenlandian army suffered heavy casualties, and those who survived dismounted and lay low when the situation became dire. Furious, these men gathered their remaining horses and rode up the hill, bypassing the burning roadblocks, intent on slaying the village ahead. As they crossed the stone bridge, they failed to notice several men emerging from the reeds along the roadside. They set up several signs inscribed with "This side faces the enemy," and then broke off a few reeds, placing them across the roadside with fuses attached. By then, the mountain mercenaries had reached the first village. The fence outside had been burned to charcoal, and a large tree stood before them on the approach. They dared not enter, fearing another swarm of Black Forest bees. Near noon, Earl Reese's main force arrived at the site of the first battle and learned the details from the wounded. What a clever trick! Earl Reese shook his head and ordered the troops to continue their advance. Behind him, the gilded knights chattered about whether Bellebac, missing for 2 days, was somewhere, engaged in a tsunami with his 4 suitors. They showed no signs of alarm. The troops soon reached the stone bridge, and the mountain mercenaries, marching in several lines, crossed the river as usual. A reed stalk lying on the ground was trampled countless times, and someone kicked it as they passed, trying to send it flying. The next moment, huge explosions erupted, and balls of fire erupted from both sides of the stone bridge. Countless steel balls rained down upon the bridge like a tsunami. At that moment, the bridge seemed shrouded in a red mist, and within a few breaths, not a single living soul remained. The mercenaries no longer dared to set foot on the bridge, and they all demanded to change their route. Count Reese's face darkened terribly, and he finally made a decision. He had the reeds on the opposite side set ablaze. After crossing the river, he divided the troops into 5 groups, each led by a farmer familiar with the terrain. The main force chose a longer route, and no unit followed the original plan. This was beyond the expectations of the harassing troops, and the traps they had set along the way were useless. Then they made a mistake and divided their own forces. This way, the damage caused by long-range killing was greatly reduced, and the enemy could ignore them and continue on their way. On the evening of April 20th, when the radio broadcast that Baron Wesson led his army to attack Rothburg, The army led by Lord Rees arrived 1 kilometer south of Heim and began to set up camp in the farmland. Morale in the camp was low. The mountain mercenaries counted their numbers and found that none of the 100 men they had initially dispatched had returned. Nearly 100 had perished on the stone bridge, and dozens had been killed or wounded along the way, nearly 10% of the troops. At dinner that evening, Earl Rees approached the Gilded Knights, asking, "Can anyone use magic to build a ramp up to the top of the wall?" Several immediately replied that they could. "Excellent," Count Rees said. "Tomorrow will attract the enemy's attention here. They're small, so they'll all gather to the south. You should quietly circle around to the rear, build a rampart, and charge directly up. Once you reach the city walls, the enemies to the south will be thrown into disarray. Then we can attack them from both sides. Once we capture Heim, you'll be the greatest contributor." The young men immediately became excited, but one remained calm. "Count Rees, you're not using us as bait, are you? If you don't attack us in time, we'll be doomed." Count Rees quickly replied, "How dare I use you as bait? If I did, would your family let me off?" These men, accustomed to relying on their family's power and influence, took it for granted when someone expressed fear of their backgrounds. They all agreed to launch a surprise attack on the North City tomorrow. Back in Heim, Otto stood on the city walls, watching expressionlessly as the daring merchants accompanying the army set up tents outside the enemy camp. Traditionally, the area where the merchants stayed with the army was considered a neutral zone. They provided logistical services such as food and beverages to the army and also purchased spoils of war, so no one would attack them. Otto called a few smart guys and asked them to go there to sell some canned food and instant noodles. Chapter 146. Can you do anything? Evening was late, but the merchant sheds were still bustling with activity. The men Otto had sent to gather information quickly sold out and returned without finding any useful intelligence. The customers were primarily mercenaries, whose battles were methodical, while the Gilded Knights maintained their own guilds and wouldn't mingle with them. Otto said to Frederick beside him, "Commander, it seems we haven't gained any useful intelligence." Frederick had recently arrived at Heim on a dawn and, after downing an energy drink, ascended the city walls. Siege tactics are essentially sieges, assaults, surprise attacks, and burrowing, he said, a lollipop in his mouth. "We'll deal with them as they come," he said, lifting a tarp. The object beneath gave him a slight toothache. At the Springfield Arsenal, signs of a firepower shortage were appearing. They had mounted 3P guns side by side on a rack, lengthened their magazines, and used the hand-cranked wheel to connect the 3 guns' magic circuits, increasing their rate of fire. It's a bit heavy, though, making it unsuitable for individual transport. It's quite useful mounted on a wall or on the back of a carriage. However, it's also an overkill. He remembered the Gatling gun's mechanism, but current ammunition production wasn't enough to support it. Otherwise, the P-gun could be converted from semi-automatic to fully automatic. Otto said, "The siege can be ruled out. Forget about digging a hole. The groundwater level here is high. I think the enemy might launch a surprise attack, but a night raid tonight isn't possible. We'll see tomorrow." "I have plans," Frederick nodded, then said, "You decide. I won't interfere. Reinforcements will arrive around noon tomorrow morning. I'll be watching from above. I'll contact you via the communicator about the enemy's deployments." Don's preferred flying altitude is around 4,000 meters, primarily because the temperature drops too low for it, and Frederick can't stand it. It's also high enough for aerial reconnaissance. Otto said happily, "This is the best. Their little tricks can't be hidden from us." Fortunately, the king did not send the fire dragon knight. "The sky's ours." Frederick leaned on the battlements of the city wall, looking at the several large counterweight catapults behind the city wall, and couldn't help saying, "Sky, have you ever heard of anyone raising fire dragons like raising chickens and ducks?" He has been thinking about the war a lot recently and is under a lot of pressure. Tonight he decided to change his mind, think about other things, and let his brain rest. It took Otto a while to catch up with his train of thought. He shook his head and said, "Many people have the same idea as you. When I was young, I helped a client steal a fire dragon cub, and that client also planned to raise a fire dragon. I heard that raising fire dragons and letting them mate and lay eggs is not difficult, but hatching the eggs is difficult. After laying eggs, the fire dragon will continuously spray dragon breath at the eggs. The flames on the eggs must never be extinguished. It will take 3 months for the fire dragon cub to hatch. You also know that the temperature of dragon breath is enough to melt steel. Let alone us, even the fire dragons themselves find it difficult to keep the flames burning for that long. So far, no one has been able to hatch them, and they themselves have also failed a lot. But wingless sub-dragons are easier to raise, like the round-headed sub-dragons. They are small in size but very strong. Mines use them to pull mine carts in the mines. There are also sail sub-dragons, which are used to pull ore out of the mines. Frederick nodded after listening. He had heard of this, but although these sub-dragon monsters are strong and can adapt to harsh environments, they also have a large appetite. They were like the mine's heavy-duty trucks. Ordinary people couldn't afford them, nor did they have the use. They were mostly used by the mine owners. After a few casual words, Frederick said to Otto, "Get some rest. Save your energy for tomorrow. I'll go check on the captives first. We'll fly away before sunrise tomorrow." Otto's smile suddenly turned lewd. After an exaggerated salute, he said, "Have a nice evening, sir." "Hey," Frederick kicked him. On April 18th, Hazenpraz fired at a female knight. The bullet ricocheted off her helmet, but the shock knocked her unconscious. She was captured, but she refused to reveal her name, and no one here could recognize her family crest. So she was held captive, awaiting ransom. Judging from the prisoner's armor, she came from a high-ranking family, and the ransom would naturally be no less than 500 florins. Therefore, her cell was immaculately cleaned, lit by a magic lamp, and furnished with bedding from the inn, along with a new set of clothes. When Frederick opened the door and entered the cell, he saw the prisoner lying on the bed, huddled under the covers, stirring and moving, unsure what she was doing. He wondered if she was preparing to escape, so, hand on his dagger, he reached over and pulled back the covers. "Ah!" The girl's scream echoed through the cell, waking the inmate in the neighboring cell. He roared, "Why are you making such a fuss so late at night? Have you any sense of public morality? Just eat the cockroaches." Frederick's mouth twitched. She was changing clothes. She had a nice figure, with visible signs of exercise, her muscles well defined. Belberg pulled the quilt over his body with one hand, pointed at the door of the cell with the other hand and shouted angrily, "Get out!" Frederick turned and walked towards the cell door that was not closed. Just when Belberg breathed a sigh of relief, she found that he had closed the door and asked the jailer outside to lock the door and ignore whatever happened inside. "What do you want to do?" Belberg's voice trembled with nervousness, and his hands tightly grasped the sheets in front of him. Frederick curled his lips. He wanted to do something that would be popular, but the Supreme Law did not agree. Belberg saw Frederick getting closer and closer to her, and her beautiful face was full of fear. Frederick asked her, "What's your name and which family are you from?" Belberg just shook her head and said nothing. Frederick glanced at her changed clothes on the bed and sneered, "It doesn't matter if you don't tell me. Just take your clothes to the Heraldry Institute and they'll help you find your family." Belberg was completely panicked. She had been so shameless to get here, and had boasted so much at home. If her family and friends knew about her capture, she would be utterly disgraced and the subject of future ridicule. "Go kill me," she said, her words threatening. "I won't bring shame upon my family." "All right," Frederick said expressionlessly, drawing the dagger from his waist. "Do it yourself, or do I help you?" The cell was underground, damp and cold. Belberg, naked, felt a chill, but it was nothing compared to the chill in her heart. She watched the gleaming blade draw closer, and a reel of memories began to race through her mind. Frederick had nothing to say to his enemy. He placed his dagger against the man's smooth, white neck and declared, "Don't worry, I'll tell your family you died a hero." With that, he exerted force, nicking a tiny sliver of skin, and Belberg burst into tears. "Don't kill me." Belberg collapsed. "I'll do anything you ask, just don't kill me." Frederick stood silently, waiting for her sobs to subside before asking, "Really?" Belberg looked up at his adorable face, a thought flashing through her mind. A blush crept in. After a moment's hesitation, she gritted her teeth and loosened her grip on the blanket. The blanket slid down over her sturdy, supple thighs, exposing her from her navel up to her chest. "Really?" she said, lowering her head slightly, her neck flushing with shyness. "I'll do anything you ask," Frederick sneered, unwilling to let her take advantage. He softly asked, "Are you very strong?" Belberg blushed and nodded. Frederick said happily, "Well, since you don't want to reveal your family, I won't force you. But you'll have to pay the ransom yourself. So, use this body to repay it, but I'm not unreasonable. If you can tell me who came with you and what their specialties are, I can reduce the ransom and save you the trouble." Selling out teammates doesn't seem like a big deal to some people. The next morning, Otto received intelligence on the opposing gilded knights. After reading it, Otto's eyes sneered and he began his preventative preparations. Chapter 147: A Short Battle. April 21st, the sound of horns replaced the crowing of cocks, drifting over the city of Heim. Count Reese suddenly realized how old he had become. The full-body plate armor he had ordered at the age of 20 was still magnificent, but it felt awkward to wear. A full-body plate armor required measurements of waist circumference, underarm chest circumference, neck crease, width with arms extended, shoulder to neck distance, shoulder to neck width, shoulder to shoulder length, shoulder to shoulder blade distance, underarm to waist distance, neck to spine length, hip circumference, waist to hip measurement, wrist to elbow circumference, elbow to shoulder and wrist length, knee width, crotch to knee distance, thigh length and width at the front, middle, and back of a squat position, calf length and width at the top, middle, and bottom of the knee to ankle, and hand length and width. Then, using a dozen different hammers, the sheet metal workers hammered the steel plates into shape until they matched the measurements. The more wealthy would even reserve space for magic circles. "It's so crowded," Count Reese sighed after putting on his tin can. "It's like lying in a coffin." His retainers thought his master's words were ominous, but being newly recruited, they didn't dare to respond. On the walls of Heim, the defenders and the 1-minute men in their uniforms were already stationed on both sides of the south gate, all with their pea shooters at their feet and traditional weapons in hand. Otto stood on the arrow platform atop the gate, carefully observing the enemy as they emerged from the camp with a telescope. The mountain mercenaries quickly formed up outside the camp and advanced to within 500 meters of the city walls. The peasants in the rear began assembling the siege equipment. Otto estimated that the siege ladders, medium catapults, and shield carts would not be assembled until noon. There was no sign of the gilded knights in their ornate armor among the troops. "Well done," Otto smiled faintly. If Frederick hadn't spotted the gilded knights from the sky, he would have thought the enemy would have assembled their siege equipment by noon, had a quick lunch, and then launched the attack in the afternoon. Around 9 o'clock, Count Reese ordered his mountain mercenaries to advance. They halted about 250 meters from the city walls, well within range of the pea guns and cherry cannons. Otto didn't order the trebuchets to fire, but instead ordered them to prepare. The 15-meter-long horizontal boom of the trebuchet behind the wall remained lowered and ready, its counterweight basket empty to avoid early detection. Soldiers began loading weights into the ladder rack next to the counterweight basket. Elsewhere, someone placed a 10-kilogram bag of angina medication in their pocket. Previous test firings suggested these bombs could be dropped in front of the army. Shortly thereafter, a sharp horn blast rang out from the north of the city. Otto immediately feigned panic, shouting at the 1-minute men, disguised as defenders, to descend the walls. Yesterday's civilians fled in panic, many falling, all captured by Count Reese's telescope. Count Reese waved his hand, and nearly 3,000 mountain mercenaries slowly advanced. The peasant soldiers behind them, urged to stop building siege weapons, followed by carrying a long staircase. In the sky, Frederick and Dawn remained hidden above a cloud, facing the sun from the battlefield. Invisible without careful observation. They occasionally emerged from the clouds to survey the landscape, taking in the entire battlefield situation. A 2-meter-wide earthen rampart had appeared on either side of Heim's north gate. The gilded knights, divided into 2 teams, each covered in a magical shield, were charging up the ramparts to scale the walls. Seeing this, Frederick recalled defending cities in Mountain Blade in his past life. His favorite activity was firing arrows at the heads on the stairs from the wall's equestrian position. With a whistle, the whetstone soldiers, previously hidden behind the wall, rose to their feet, and the tarpaulins covering their 3-line pea shooters were instantly lifted. The 10-meter-long rampart suddenly erupted in a multicolored light. A torrential downpour of bullets overloaded the magic shields, causing them to collapse into bursts of light, followed by sprays of crimson blood. Under the crossfire, the 45-based knights collapsed to the ground, and the earthen slopes vanished, leaving them all on the ground. Fires were then lit throughout the city, and thick smoke billowed into the sky, as if the streets were ablaze. With another wave of his hand, Earl Reese's army rapidly approached the city walls. At that moment, several wooden poles, taller than the walls themselves, suddenly rose from behind them. Black objects flew out, landing in front and behind the army. The city had massive trebuchets, something no one had anticipated. Even more surprising was that the trebuchets hurled not just stones but explosives. Countless steel balls, accompanied by a resounding explosion, tore through the ranks, instantly crumbling over 200 men. The surviving mercenaries, reminded of the scene on the stone bridge yesterday morning, slowed their pace. Gunfire rang out from the walls, and dozens more fell. The mountain mercenaries had never experienced such a rapid loss of life. Their minds went blank, and nearly 100 more men fell in that short time. One young recruit, unable to bear it, dropped his weapon and took flight. The first to flee was followed by a second and a third, and in a flash, the entire army collapsed. No one stopped the mercenaries, and Count Rice outran them. He understood that the enemy's new weapons were no match for him. His horse had been injured by the explosion, and now he needed to run as far as he could while his horse still had strength. Frederick, watching from the air, could see smoke and dust billowing several kilometers to the east, indicating the arrival of two main regiments. He immediately flew over, commanding the main regiment to block the enemy to the south, while Otto led his troops in pursuit, giving them no chance to rest. Under Frederick's aerial guidance, the main regiment formed a defensive line over a kilometer long, encircling a village and a small river that flowed through it, trapping the fleeing enemy. Babo's squad was positioned between a firewood forest and a stream. From time to time, a few fleeing soldiers would run into the forest, easily captured. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, there was no sound, and everyone began to take turns eating. Babo was munching on a marching biscuit while Metzger, munching on a biscuit, pointed to a thicket in the forest and said, "If I were the enemy, I'd hide in there until dark and then come out." Someone nearby laughed and said, "Then go in and capture them. Do you think I'm stupid?" Metzger rolled his eyes at his comrade. Why not set fire to the bushes and be done with it? He then picked up a fist-sized stone from nearby, tossed it in his hand, and said with a smile, "This forest isn't very big. Maybe I can hit someone with this stone." With that, he hurled the stone into the woods. The stone hit a tree, bounced off, and landed in the grass with a dull thud. Metzger's previously cheerful face suddenly turned serious. He leaped from the ground, whipping out his revolver with his left hand and firing a single shot at the spot where the rock had fallen. He then rushed forward. As everyone stood there in bewilderment, a beautiful tin can suddenly leaped out from the brush. Without hesitation, Metzger fired his bullets into the can's body. However, his revolver was weak, and the armor was heavily enchanted with defensive magic. After several bursts of light, he failed to deal fatal damage to the can's body. He was still able to strike back with his mace. Finally, Metzger smashed his revolver into the can's visor, seizing the opportunity to attack from the side. The enemy was no novice, unfazed by the visor hit, and turned to strike with his mace. Seeing this, Metzger ducked, waited for the mace to pass overhead, and lunged, knocking the can to the ground. The two rolled in the brush. Metzger realized he was outmatched and was pinned to the ground by the can's neck. Metzger immediately drew the bayonet from his waist and stabbed it between Tin Can's helmet and armor. Blood instantly gushed out along the bayonet, and Tin Can let out two gasps before collapsing heavily on Metzger. "Stop watching the fun," Metzger shouted. "Help me move him away." Babo had already gathered with his men, armed with weapons. Someone said with a smile, "We don't want to take credit for your work, you guys." Metzger pushed Tin Can away and sat up, rubbing his neck and panting. Chapter 148 Pre-War Arrangements. April 22nd, a north wind blew, and the weather was a little cooler than usual. A light rain suddenly fell in the early morning, and a thick fog rose just as the sun rose. In the Allied camp outside Hausen, Crown Prince Rudolf, Count Ansbach, Count Firth, and Count Roth all had gloomy faces. Count Eichstadt simply lay in the arms of His Royal Highness the Crown Prince and cried uncontrollably. The good news was that the main force of the Wesson army had been transferred to Heim as previously planned. The bad news was that Count Reese had died in battle, and now Roth, Eichstadt, and Reese were all occupied by Baron Wesson. Even worse news was that of the 50 gilded knights who had been sent to Count Reese, all but one was missing. Considering that the missing person was a young girl, her fate was probably worse than death in battle. No one spoke in the tent, everyone was thinking their own thoughts. Rudolf was now oblivious to the beauty in his arms. His mind was at a loss, preoccupied with how to face the accusations of the 50 families upon his return to Cologne. Count Ansbach was undecided, unsure whether Frederick would reinforce Hausen or attack his homeland from a different route. Count Roth found some peace. He wasn't the only one left without a home, at least he was better off than Reese. still alive. Count Eichstadt could do nothing but cry now. Leading troops in battle was beyond his capabilities. Count Firth was much calmer. His home was far away, and Baron Wesson probably wouldn't go there. No one offered any advice or suggestions on the current battle situation. Precious time slipped away, leaving nearly 30,000 people idle in the camp. No one saw anything wrong with this. The idyllic pace of agricultural life was slow, and even though Frederick was waging a near-daily annihilation campaign, the inertia of thinking remained unchanged. When the fog completely cleared, Ansbach finally made up his mind and told Rudolf, "We'll build the siege engines today and attack Hausen tomorrow. If it's foggy tomorrow morning as well, we'll take advantage of the fog to approach the city walls." Rudolf, still mulling over how to explain his plan to everyone when he returned, agreed without a second thought. Meanwhile, Frederick, Franz the Younger, and the others breathed a sigh of relief. Led by Jules, the former steward of Count Ries, the army traversed the foggy mountain roads, crossing the hills and ridges to the border between Ansbach and Wesson. The area was bordered by mountains to the west and a river to the east, with a passage about 1.5 kilometers wide, linking the two lands. Frederick and Franz the Younger's plan was simple: take advantage of the advantageous terrain at the foot of the mountain and engage the enemy's main force head-on. The enemy's main force consisted of over 10,000 infantry, over 1,000 cavalry, approximately 70 tin cans, and 30 magicians. The maximum mobilized mobile force of the Wessenland territory numbered approximately 10,000 men, including two main regiments of 4,000 men and a corps militia of approximately 6,000. Currently, some of the corps militia were deployed to defend newly conquered territory. For this battle, 3,000 men could be deployed to defend the flanks and 1,000 to defend the rear. If the Wessenland army could defeat this massive enemy force head-on, it would create a situation where one strike is enough to prevent 100 blows, deterring potential enemies from resorting to force and bolstering the confidence and security of both the new and old territories. On the afternoon of the 22nd, after a thorough rest in the mountains, the Wessenland army took up its position and began constructing fortifications. A convoy returning to the Ansbach territory with supplies was dispersed by a cavalry company. Only then did the Count of Ansbach and his men realize that the enemy had already appeared 5 kilometers behind them. "What should I do?" Rudolf panicked. Towards him lay the city of Hausen, behind him stood the Wessenland army, which had captured 3 cities in a row, and to either side were rivers and mountains. It was clear they were surrounded. Count Ansbach said in a deep voice, "There's no other solution. Break out early tomorrow morning. As long as we defeat Wesson's main force, everything will be easy." His biggest concern now was whether Frederick had stolen his property. Everything else was easy. But this time, there was no need to worry. Frederick hadn't stolen his property. Ansbach was vast compared to other places, and there were no wise men willing to turn to the light. He might be caught in a pincer attack. On the hill near the intended battlefield, Frederick, Franz the Younger, and others were discussing tomorrow's tactics. They believed the greatest threat tomorrow was the over 1,000 light cavalrymen. If they were willing to pave the way with corpses, they would likely overrun the infantry formations. The river to the east had just receded, and the riverbank was muddy, sinking up to the shins. It wasn't suitable for large-scale cavalry operations. The foot of the hill to the west was much more suitable. The ground was firm, and while there were some weeds and thorns, it wouldn't hinder the horses' movement. Frederick regretted not having put up the barbed wire in time. It would have made the situation much easier. Now the only option was to bury this side faces the enemy in the brush. It should be effective. "Set up a concealed flanking position there," Frederick said, pointing to the hill ahead. "They don't have to worry about anything else, just fire from the side whenever the enemy passes." Little Franz replied, "We could station a company of chasseurs there, supplemented by some militia." Frederick added, "Put some mines around the perimeter, and ideally deploy some close-range mushroom guns. The enemy will attack if they find them." Little Franz agreed. There was an area on the hillside behind the mountain that could accommodate hundreds of people quickly. Everyone agreed that this was a necessary defense, but they didn't have enough mines, so they buried the unused 10 kilograms bottles of angina medication from Heim in the grass by the roadside. After the inspection, Frederick asked Gad, "Your magician company can use new weapons this time. How do you plan to fight?" Gad thought for a moment and replied, "I plan to set up positions on several hilltops behind the enemy lines. I'll also give me a company of hunters. We can immediately eliminate the enemy magicians. Frederick thought for a moment and said, okay. You should prepare a few hiding spots first. Ideally, you can form an ambush position with the hunters to eliminate those searching for you. The discussion was quickly concluded, and everyone went about their business. Frederick returned to the camp in the mountains and fed Dawn a large bucket of oats and a small bucket of its favorite sweet radishes. That evening, an explosion suddenly occurred in the Allied camp, and several carts of freshly loaded food and fodder in the parking lot quickly caught fire. The wind fanned the flames, and the fire quickly spread. Fortunately, the magicians in the camp acted swiftly and quickly brought the fire under control. From the air, Frederick saw the entire camp in chaos, as if they were trying to catch a lurking enemy. He still had plenty of bombs left, but there was no rush. He'd wait until they stopped before throwing one. However, before he could make his second move, he spotted a detachment of troops quietly moving out from Hausen, bringing with them 5 large torsion-driven catapults. Old Franz, using the weeds for cover, slowly pushed the catapults to within 100 meters of the camp. As for the sentries in that direction, they had already been killed from behind. Frederick curled his lips. One of them looked remarkably like Afu. After these retreated, the catapults quickly launched 20 kilograms barrels of angina medication, each coated in charcoal, into the camp. After a flash of orange-red light and a deafening roar, 4 clearings appeared in the camp, tents and people blown away by the shockwaves. Only one bomb flew into a cesspool, causing minimal physical damage but a profound psychological toll. A certain prince, exiting his tent, was knocked back by a flying butt. The explosion occurred after someone saw something flying in from outside, prompting a cavalry unit to leave the camp in search. However, shortly after these dozens of cavalrymen left the camp, bullets fired from the brush instantly knocked them to the ground. Old Franz, taking advantage of the situation, booby-trapped his catapult, anticipating its destruction, and fled with his men. Chaos reigned in the camp, forcing Count Ansbach to order his magicians to erect a camp-wide magical shield to reassure the soldiers. Controlling large-scale magic was mentally draining, and Count Ansbach, believing Frederick would not initiate an attack, neglected to order his magicians to erect the shield, resulting in a sudden blow. A magical shield, resembling a pot lid, appeared above the camp, enveloping the entire sky and casting a faint blue hue on the ground. Frederick studied it, and with the theoretical knowledge Psyche had taught him, he could now recognize many spells. He quickly identified it as a minced meat wind that resembled a wind steel shield. The wind steel shield, a hard layer of wind elemental material formed through a specially arranged, roaring arrangement, is a commonly used magical shield that can also double as an umbrella. The minced meat wind, said to have been invented by a magician who worked as a chef, is a violent, turbulent layer of wind elemental energy that rips anything it touches into shreds. This magical shield also offers the advantage of ventilation. Among the foolish deaths of magicians, several have suffocated themselves within their shields, suggesting this method can also be used to suffocate others. Frederick also escaped. A vigilant enemy is not easy to deal with, and he might even be killed. He escaped, but others remained in hiding. 5 middle-aged and elderly men, still agile, their attire, demeanor, and appearance no different from those of other peasant soldiers, took advantage of the recent chaos to lurk into the peasant camp. In the dead of night, they quietly approached a parking lot where horse-drawn carriages were parked. The carriages were loaded with javelins used by cavalry, ready for the next day's march, making them high-value targets. "How is it going?" a white-haired, blue-eyed man whispered to his companion. "Can you still do it?" "Of course," the man replied confidently. "I haven't wasted any time these past few years." The next moment, the magicians in the barracks suddenly opened their eyes and scrambled out of their tents. In the parking lot, the violent wind element formed a relentless tornado, sucking up everything in its path and hurling it in all directions after accelerating. For a moment, the barracks rained down javelins. Chapter 149, Kill the General and Seize the Flag. The rising sun ignited the white clouds, turning the sky the color of roses. Birds fluttered in the rosy glow, bees swarmed through the trees in search of blossoms, and slimes emerged from the cracks between rocks and trees. For them, it was just another ordinary, repetitive day. In the mountains, an army had assembled, listening to the commander's pre-battle mobilization speech. Bravo, warriors! You may be wondering why you are standing here today. This is a good question, a question worthy of our deep reflection. I can tell you right now, today, We are standing here together because justice has been trampled upon, loyalty has been trampled upon, and greedy hungry dogs have sharpened their claws to break into our homes and steal our money, our food, and our families. Perhaps some people will say, can't we just give them something to send them away? Think about it, where did your property come from? Did it fall from the sky? Or was it accumulated bit by bit through the labor of yourself and your family? If you don't cherish this property in your hands now, and treat it as weeds, giving it a few copper coins today and a few kroits tomorrow, in exchange for a few good nights' sleep, but when you wake up again, you find that there is nothing left in your house, but the robbers are standing outside the door again. Our property is limited, but the robbers' greed is unlimited. The more you give, the more often they come. In the end, our homes will be seized by bandits, our wives and daughters raped, and our entire families sold into pagan lands to be slaves, rising earlier than chickens, sleeping later than mice, working harder than donkeys, and eating worse than slimes, until we die of exhaustion. We stand together here today not because we enjoy killing, not because we're bored, but to protect our homes, our property, and our families. Hold your weapons. Put on your helmets. Cast away your fear. Remember, behind us lies everything we hold most dear. Frederick's voice echoed not only through the mountains but also through relays to every radio. On April 23, 1026, the entire Wessenland region came to a virtual standstill, everyone anxiously awaiting news from the front. In Maria's castle in Lohr, besides Maria and her family, the Grand Duke of Mainz and a host of the duchy's military and political leaders gathered in the living room, listening to the radio for the half-hour delayed news. At 9 o'clock in the morning, the Allied forces appeared, pressing down like a wall, stirring up clouds of dust and causing the earth to tremble slightly. The Allied forces halted 400 meters from the Western army and, amidst the sound of bugles, began to adjust their formation. 10,000 infantry were deployed on the east side of the river, with archers in the front, spearmen in the middle, and heavy infantry in the rear. 1,000 light cavalry were deployed on the west side of the hill, along with the tin cans. Judging by the flags, Count Ansbach was in the center, with Counts Rudolf and Eichstadt also here. Count Roth commanded the infantry on the east side, and Count Firth commanded all the cavalry. On the western side, the Golden Angels and Snow Leopards were deployed side by side, with squads spaced out to increase depth, and the cavalry company was deployed in the rear. Franz the Younger's tactics were simple: use defense to wear down the enemy cavalry, then eliminate the enemy infantry. Traditionally, at this point, the commanders of both armies would have exchanged verbal exchanges. Count Ansbach and Rudolf were marching out of the battle formation, while Frederick, riding Dawn, approached the front of the army from the cavalry tunnel between the eastern position and the riverbank. Dawn was in high spirits today, pawing the ground with its front legs, its golden horn gleaming faintly. Frederick scratched its head, thinking, what a warmonger, but he was still young, and it would be years before he could ride it into battle, slaying the enemy and capturing the flag. Then, something unexpected happened. Dawn seemed to sense Frederick's thoughts, but its understanding was limited, so it only took the part about him riding it into battle, slaying the enemy and capturing the flag out of context. Excited, it galloped toward the enemy formation ahead. With a gentle flap of its wings, it accelerated to a speed of 50 meters per second, and in less than 10 seconds, it was right in front of the enemy spearmen, leaving everyone present completely stunned. Many of the Allied spearmen were stunned. They'd seen unicorns before, the Crown Prince rode one, but they'd never seen one with wings. As the saying goes, the stranger the monster, the more powerful it is. Could such a strange beast be carnivorous like the mountain dragons? How could two people possibly be full without a single meal? Frederick was even more bewildered. The push on his back had barely passed when the gleaming spear had loomed before him. He had no choice but to charge. Luckily, he had his weapons with him, so he quickly grabbed the mushroom gun placed in front of his saddle. Dawn's horn shone brightly, and with a lowered head, a golden beam of magic blasted forward, sending the spearman flying in its path. Frederick narrowed his eyes, causing Dawn to turn her head. Instantly, she swept across the open space and charged in. In the Allied formation, Count Roth was bewildered. He had just been listening to messenger relay Count Ansbach's orders, and for a moment, he hadn't noticed the spearmen in front of him taking flight. The spearmen ahead of him were terrified. Just a moment before, they were a surging mass of people, now they were suddenly the front line. Seeing the winged unicorn approaching, they finally turned and fled. Frederick ordered Dawn to charge Count Roth. The distance between them rapidly closed, and in a blink of an eye, it was less than 30 meters. Royce and several other Roth knights immediately protected Count Roth as Frederick fired at them. Steel balls pelted Royce and his men, their speed imparting immense kinetic energy, piercing their armor. Layers of mail and padding were unable to absorb the remaining energy, transferring it to the bodies behind them. The knights initially suffered only broken ribs and were able to counterattack. As Frederick closed in, the destructive power of his bullets grew. Finally, a ball fired from less than 2 meters away still delivered considerable damage even after piercing the rock armor condensed by the earth element. The old knight Royce collapsed in despair. The knights bought enough time for Count Roth to recover. He removed the mace from his saddle and rushed towards Frederick. The nails on the hammer had flashed with lightning. Frederick was only wearing a white military uniform, a silver scale breastplate underneath, and no helmet. A hit would have either killed him or crippled him. More importantly, Frederick's mushroom gun was out of bullets. In a flash, Frederick drew his sword, and dawn suddenly accelerated, just as Count Roth's mace was raised. At that moment, Frederick felt that everything in the world had slowed down, as if someone had slowed down the speed of the video. Count Roth's plate armor protected his entire body, even his armpits, which were most vulnerable, with round plates protecting the front. However, he raised his hands at this moment, revealing the mail under his armpits. A flash of fire erupted from Frederick's hand, swirling around the blade of the remit's sword, accelerating towards its tip. A fireball spell, a technique even for a beginner in magic, quickly formed on the blade's tip. Count Roth instantly determined it was just a common fireball spell. Even if it struck him, it would at most temporarily cripple his right hand, something he could pay the priests of the Church of Light to heal after the battle. In contrast, if he could strike Frederick, the war would be overturned and ended. The tip of the remit's sword pierced the mail under Count Roth's armpit. The fireball exploded forward upon contact, the white-hot fire element breaking through the dark red camouflage and instantly pouring through the gaps in the mail. There, it flowed like paste, incinerating everything around it. Count Roth collapsed, white smoke and a foul odor emanating from the crevices of his armor. Frederick didn't even glance at him. He simply leisurely leaped from the dawn, chopped down a nearby flagpole with his sword, took down the Roth banner, and then walked away, as if he were walking into a deserted place. It all happened so suddenly and so quickly that no one on the battlefield reacted. Only Jurgen and the others who had arrived did they manage to reach the center of the opposing armies. Frederick watched as their expressions shifted from nervousness to admiration. Many years later, the Romance of Emperor Wei of the Western Extremes, published by Tao Huishi, included a poem praising this passage. The hero's brilliance is revealed today, testing his sword for the first time amidst a vast army. From the moment he steps out, he unleashes his might, dominating the Western paradise and making his mark. Chapter 150 The Magician Company's New Weapon. Frederick, holding the Roth banner high on his sword, raced back and forth in front of the army, drawing a thunderous cheer from the soldiers. A general is the heart of his soldiers. Everyone had always assumed Frederick was only capable of talking or throwing things from the sky, a fact dismissed due to his youth. But no one expected him to suddenly and single-handedly slay a general and seize the banner amidst the vast enemy, instantly boosting morale. From the soldiers at the battlefront to the Archduke of Mainz in faraway Lohr, and even Count Ansbach and his men, everyone believed Frederick had done this on purpose. If asked for an explanation, everyone attributed it to the instruction of the swordsman, Sir Richardner. Count Ansbach dared not advance his rhetoric. What if Frederick struck him too? Rudolf, naturally, was also afraid. Although he rode a unicorn, it lacked wings, making it impossible to escape. The two men retreated in dismay and began directing their troops to attack. A trumpet blasted, signaling the Allied cavalry on the western flank to prepare for action. According to the previously discussed tactics, the light cavalry would first harass the Wesson infantry with javelins. Once a breach was discovered, the heavy cavalry would charge through, followed by the light cavalry to widen the gap, and then the infantry would press in. However, a large number of javelins had been destroyed last night, and the tips of the javelins that fell from the air were deformed, so the tactics changed accordingly. Count Firth and his cavalry were about to set out. The light cavalry's mission was to concentrate their intact javelins on the western flank to disrupt the enemy formation. The heavy cavalry would then charge, while the light cavalry elsewhere would use their damaged javelins to contain the enemy. The magicians approached the cavalry, preparing to shield them. Over 600 meters away, on the hilltop, Beneath the bushes, a company of Wesson magicians had already trained their principal thrusters on their enemies' counterparts. The principal thruster had a caliber of 15 millimeters, a total length of 2.3 meters, and a total weight of 30 kilograms. It used a 100 millimeter caliber jet canister originally developed for jet cannons. It fired a steel core copper-clad bullet, loaded with a bolt action. A telescope, repurposed from a monocular, was mounted above the barrel. It could penetrate ordinary magic shields at a distance of 800 meters. It earned its name after Frederick, while testing it, failed to properly position the gun and was thrown back by the immense recoil. This gun was prohibitively expensive and difficult to manufacture, preventing mass production. However, its large size made it easy to enchant, making it popular among magicians. After all, the members of the magician company were faculty and students of the University of Wessenland, and everyone wanted to eliminate their enemies from a distance to protect themselves. Gad quickly assigned targets. As he fired his gun, the other magicians opened fire in 2 successive volleys. Bullets imbued with various magical elements flew toward their targets at over twice the speed of sound. Gad's first shot missed, striking the target 2 finger widths behind the heel. But that wasn't a major problem. The instant the bullets landed, a violent explosion erupted. When the dust cleared, the magician's leg could be seen twisting forward. The other magicians fared no better. Although some immediately deployed their shields, the next moment, a burst of fire, lightning, and a storm erupted. The bullets, packed with immense energy, shattered their shields in a flash. The warped, deformed, and even shattered bullet still carried immense devastation. Some magicians managed to dodge the initial barrage, but the shattered shields took their toll. Then came the second round, leaving the mages' bodies horribly damaged, few of them intact. Count Ansbach was stunned by the sudden turn of events, and the fear of death washed over him. He immediately ordered 500 men to search the area where the strange noises had come from. The hordes were targeting Gad's favorites, and before they had even moved 100 meters, they were utterly routed and fled. Count Ansbach, figuring that this weapon's range was limited, immediately ordered Count Firth to march with his cavalry, and the infantry to advance 100 meters. He also deployed 2,000 men toward the river to prevent the enemy from the mountains from emerging. He also addressed the female sorceress beside him, dressed in a dark green robe and a wide-brimmed, pointed witch's hat. "Princess Altisha, I beg for your help." This summoner was the Allied forces' trump card, unleashed only now. Altisha lifted the brim of her hat, glancing at the Wesson army across the way, and nodded silently. She rode to the front of the formation, raised her wand, and began to cast a spell. 36 hexagrams appeared on the ground ahead, and fiery red shadows emerged from them. Frederick had returned to the command tower at the rear. He watched the summoner's actions through a telescope, and the corners of his mouth twitched. "It's a fire elemental creature," he said to little Franz beside him. "I didn't expect such creatures to exist." Little Franz frowned. The cavalry on the west side began to move, and dozens of flaming giants over 10 meters tall appeared in the middle. He ordered the entire army to return to their positions. "Ah, they've escaped," Rudolph shouted excitedly. The entire Wesson army turned back and ran in unison. They thought the enemy had been frightened and was fleeing. But the next moment, the entire Wesson army seemed to suddenly jump into the ground and disappear. At first, they had stood there, using their bodies to cover the fortifications behind them. Now, everyone orderly descended the trenches and returned to their positions. All that could be seen were the chevaux de frise and low earthen embankments. Frederick said to little Franz, "Inform the company magicians to aim at the elemental crystals in the elementals' bodies. Destroy them and they will disappear." Little Franz immediately transmitted the order via communicator to the other companies, and soon after, gunfire rang out from the positions. At Altisha's command, the fire elemental giants advanced, hurling massive balls of flame. Dozens of fireballs erupted across the battlefield, striking some trenches and causing casualties among the Wesson army. Elemental creatures originate from a world infused with magical elements and possess an elemental crystal within their bodies. Frederick had heard from Almite that this elemental crystal is the seed of their souls. The control cores of the golems were originally modeled after elemental crystals. Only by shattering them could elemental creatures be destroyed, even cracks would be ineffective. The fire elemental giant before them stood over 10 meters tall and intimidating, yet the elemental crystal within its body was the size of a refrigerator, making it easy to hide at a distance of 300 meters. However, The outer fire element possessed considerable defensive capabilities, and the crystal itself was extremely hard, so 1 or 2 bullets were insufficient to cause devastating damage. At this point, parts of the P and Cherry companies joined the fray, weakening the outer fire elemental layer of the crystals. Then, the magicians launched a deadly attack. On the allied side, Artish's face, once pale and somewhat sickly, suddenly darkened. They hadn't expected the enemy to know the elemental creature's weaknesses, having not appeared on this land for 200 years. Then, a giant fire elemental's elemental crystal was shattered, and it suddenly resembled a deflated balloon, countless fire elementals losing their restraints and dissipating into the air. After the first, there was the second, and then more and more, until they were all destroyed. However, this also greatly distracted Wessen's firepower. To the west, heavy cavalry had broken through the first line of defense and were advancing deeper into the enemy lines. Little Franz ignored this and let them pass. His own men were in the trenches anyway, so he would crouch down when they approached, and if he had the nerve, he would jump in and cut them down. Behind the positions lay the battlefield for destroying these tin cans. End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.